Hi, everyone. If you could take your seats in a few moments, I would love to introduce Mark Carr. Yes, we are missing our one last panelist.
Oh, okay. Oh, sure, sure.
So up here we have our third panel. It is going to focus on urban design and urban solutions within the context of environmental justice. Our moderator for this panel is Mark Carr, who is sitting on the end. He has a background working in civil rights campaigns in the Deep South. He's also organized community forums in the U.S. and West Africa. He is the founder of Social Solutions, an organization devoted to crowdsourcing tech solutions to solve intractable social problems. And he's also frequently at events like this in DC and hosting these types of events. So we're very happy to have him here today. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. Wow, that's loud. Are you guys okay? Is the energy still up in the room? Are you all still ready to go out and change the world? Well, my name is Mark Carr, and I want to tell a little bit about myself, and then I want to invite the panelists to talk a little bit about themselves and their work. I got into this work, Social Solutions, just to give you a little bit more information, is an organization that really focuses on reducing mass incarceration. So we host community forums, we gather data, and we use design thinking to help create new solutions to this problem, which in my opinion, is the biggest civil rights issue of our time. I got into this work. I don't have a law background, but I have an MBA. And I worked for 2 years in West Africa. And when I came back, I wanted to get into social enterprise and social justice using business type work. So I went after my MBA, I was in American University in the social enterprise program, and I was leading an initiative back in West Africa in August of 2014. Does anyone know what happened in August of 2014?
August of 2014.
I believe it was August 9th, 8th or 9th. Well, a gentleman named Mike Brown was assassinated in Ferguson, Missouri. And I grew up in Jennings, Missouri, which is right next to Ferguson. So I knew that community very well. And actually, that was the same day that I was traveling back to the US. I was in the airport in Accra. And you know how in airports you always see the news playing, but no sound? Well, I saw the news playing, and I didn't hear the sound, but what I saw were images that looked very familiar. And so when I came back, I was in West Africa working on some international development type of initiative. But when I came back, I started to think critically about mass incarceration. I started to do research. I read the new Jim Crow. I started organizing events. And what I quickly learned is the concept of intersectionality and environmental injustice or racism being one of those things, and gentrification also being one of those things. So I'm excited to have this conversation more in depth with our three distinguished panelists. I'm going to introduce them briefly, and then I'm going to invite them to talk a little bit about themselves and their work. So the furthest right of me, all the way on the end, we have Vernice Miller Travis, who's with Scapegoat Solutions. Right in the middle here, we have Denise Fairchild, who is with Emerald Cities Collaborative. And right next to me, I'm sorry, I switched it up. I'm sorry, I wasn't looking well enough. So let's start it over. All the way to the end is Vernice Miller Travis from Scapegoat Solutions. Skio Solutions. Thank you for correcting me. In the middle is Dr. Erica Holloman with Southeast Care Coalition. And right next to me is Denise Fairchild with Emerald Cities Collaborative. Ladies, starting with Vernice Miller Travis, can you introduce yourselves and talk a little bit about your work?
How much time would you like us to spend on that?
You know what? Let's keep it to a minute or less. How
Okay.
about that?
Oh, geez. Wow. Okay. So I am originally from Harlem, New York. I grew up there, lived there my whole life. My Mom is originally from Ellicott City, Maryland, and Baltimore. So I've always had a connection to the Chesapeake Bay, and our family still lives here, and now I live here in Bowie, Maryland. I am the co-founder of a nonprofit organization in New York, We Act for Environmental Justice, and my colleague, is she still here? Is Marion still here? Well, Marion Edelman-Lago, who you heard from earlier, Marion is a member of the board of We Act, and Marion was our first lawyer when she worked at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund in 1988. We brought a case to try to keep a hospital open in the community. I have worked at the Natural Resources Defense Council as the Director of Environmental Justice. I created an environmental justice grant-making portfolio at the Ford Foundation. I've led other nonprofit organizations, but I have worked in this field, and I guess most importantly, I worked in the late 80s at the United Church of Christ Commission for Racial Justice with a guy who is the father of environmental justice, Charles Lee, and helped to write and produce a groundbreaking report entitled Toxic Waste and Race in the United States. That was the first report to look at the relationship between race and the location of hazardous waste sites, which really began to document for the first time in a non-anecdotal way, in a very clinical way, that the experience that people of color and poor people have documented experientially in terms of living near the worst environmental facilities in the country that have long-term health impacts, that was not a figment of their imagination. In fact, it is true, and it is baked into our land use and zoning process, which we'll talk some more about as we go forward.
Thank you.
Sorry for more than,
No, you did great.
way more than a minute.
Yeah. So, good afternoon. My name is Erica Holloman, and I am the Coalition Coordinator for the Southeast Care Coalition out of Newport News, Virginia. Southeast Care Coalition is a grassroots, community-based alliance of community residents, community organizations, community-based businesses, local academic institutions, as well as both city, state, and federal partners. We've been addressing environmental concerns of the community in Newport News for the last 5 years officially, but unofficially as an undergraduate student from Hampton University. Originally from Atlanta, Georgia. When I matriculated to Hampton, I found my way over to Newport News, where I was astounded at the proximity between the houses and the cold holding facilities. If any of you are familiar with 664 and travel through the Monitor Merrimack Tunnel, either which way, as you're going through, you'll notice the large coal holding facilities on your right or left, and then the community to the right or left, depending upon which way you're coming. So as an undergraduate student, I would hear the concerns of elders who live close to those areas talk about coal dust and other things. But as a budding environmental scientist, I knew that there were other things that were also of concern outside of what you visibly could really see. And so I've had the fortunate time to work with this community and Leslie mentioned it earlier, about bringing community issues to a national level, and that's what we've been doing, and have been definitely able to leverage partnerships.
Thank you.
Great. Good afternoon. What's up? I'm Denise Fairchild, and I'm the national director of a nonprofit organization called Emerald Cities Collaborative. And we're a coalition of labor, community, and business organizations that's really pushing what we call high road economies. So what does that mean? That means we've got a 3-part mission. Part 1 is how do we green our cities? Secondly, while we build our communities, and thirdly, ensure that we promote equity in that process. I would describe myself, I'm an urban planner and have lived 40 years of my professional life in the sort of planning, community economic development field. And in that context, so I am a reluctant environmental justice advocate. I have always fought environmental issues. When I went to grad school in urban planning at Penn, all of the environmental laws were being sort of born and created at a time when, for me, we're still fighting for economic justice and civil rights. And I was seeing, the birds and the trees taking over, fundamental civil rights, economic justice issues. And so, it was always the jobs versus the environment. I was on the job side of this equation and continued to fight this until I was drug into an environmental justice fight. I lived 35 years in South Los Angeles, was on the Environmental Quality Board for the city of LA during Mayor Bradley's term, and the next thing I know, the community's coming to me about this thing called Lancer, which is a municipal incinerator being sited in the middle of our community, spitting distance from homes and from schools, turned into a 3-year community fight. We ultimately won, but still, for me, I'm still, it's about economic justice. It wasn't until about 2003, I read a book that finally brought me into the intersection of environment, economy, and equity, and I have been now working, diligently in 10 cities across the country, trying to push a new vision of what America and the globe could be.
What was the book, Denise?
I was going to say something.
It's called Restoration Economy by Storm Cunningham.
You gotta write that down. No, thank you guys for the introductions. And I just want to lay down a little, one rule of engagement. This is a discussion. So you guys, I'm depending on you from your experience and expertise in environmental injustice, and I want you guys just to be as candid as you want to get. If I'm going in an area and I should go a different way, feel free to chime in. So with that being said, I think with our next question or our next discussion topic, it would be useful to discuss intersectionality again. For me, well, first, before I even go into that, I'll at least define for myself what I think gentrification is, because the topic of this discussion is on gentrification. For me, gentrification is when higher income people move into lower income tracts, and they buy homes, which over time causes the property values to go out and could cause displacement. So for me, there's a very distinct difference between gentrification per se and displacement, which is a consequence of gentrification if it isn't regulated. I think that's important to note, because a lot of times we sort of, when I say we, I mean people in the activist community especially, we sort of confuse gentrification with the outcomes of gentrification. So that's, at least from my opinion, how I'm framing this discussion. The panelists may have their own or more, tailored definitions of gentrification. So again, my background is with criminal justice reform, specifically tackling this huge issue of mass incarceration. And so for me, there's a very distinct link between gentrification or some of the effects of gentrification and mass incarceration. One is the criminalization of Black bodies. When communities change, when the demographics shift, when they sometimes go from a community that's, because mind you, white people aren't the only people who can be gentrifiers. Black people can too. But in many communities, there are white gentrifiers. And because of that, Black bodies in certain positions can become criminalized. So, and I'm speaking purely from qualitative data that we've collected through speaking with people in the community. But oftentimes when community changes, if I'm a young Black male, I'm unemployed, I'm outside, I could be seen as a threat. The police could be called on me. And there was a big incident last year in Capitol Hill where there was a young Black guy going into a bank, minding his own business, and there was a white couple walking out, and they felt he looked suspicious, and so they called the police. And the police arrested him, arrested his friend as well. It was found that he wasn't doing anything but trying to access his funds that was in his bank because that was his bank. So that I'm just using that as an example, an illustration of how mass incarceration and gentrification can be linked. Another example of how environmental injustice and mass incarceration can be linked, I think, is greatly illustrated with the case of Freddie Gray, who was diagnosed with lead poisoning. And as Leslie Fields noted earlier, lead poisoning is a huge environmental hazard, mainly in low-income communities with substandard old housing stocks that still have the lead paint. So that's an environmental issue that often translates into a criminal justice issue when you take young people who have been diagnosed with lead poisoning, and we know what happens when you've been diagnosed with lead poisoning. Sometimes it causes aggressive behavior. Sometimes it causes irrational behavior. And instead of addressing that as a mental health, or sorry, not a mental health, but as a health issue and an environmental issue, we address it as a criminal issue. So with that being said, I'm going to ask the panelists, you guys can just jump in as you will. How are environmental issues and gentrification, or the issues that could stem from gentrification, how are they related?
Well, let's take an issue in the district. So, do you all know where the Navy Yard is? Do you know that there's sort of a white building over there where the Navy Yard is? That's the Commandant of the Navy's home. That's where he actually lives. The Commandant of the Navy has lived there since the 1700s. It's the oldest continually serving military installation in the United States, is the DC Navy Yard. After many decades, centuries of shipbuilding and all kinds of related activities related to shipbuilding, that body of water, that part of the Potomac, became exceedingly contaminated, and it was declared a Superfund site by the United States Environmental Protection Agency. So a Superfund site, or designation of the Superfund site under the Comprehensive Environmental Response Claims and Liability Act, or CERCLA, shortly known as Superfund, gives the federal government the opportunity to identify sites that pose imminent threat to human health and the environment, right? So they felt that that site was so contaminated and it was posing such a threat to the Potomac River and to the Bay that it needed to be cleaned up imminently. So in the 1990s, beginning around about 1995, 1996, they began to do an active remediation of the Navy Yard. Once the Navy Yard was cleaned up, it then became identified as a prime space for redevelopment in DC. And so now all the development that you see on the Southwest waterfront is all connected to the cleanup of the Superfund site at the Navy Yard. Had they not cleaned up that site, it would still be an industrial area. One of the things that folks who live in a district, I've lived just outside the district in Prince George's County for the last 18 years, you know that that part of DC was also where a tremendous amount of public housing was located. And that often is the case. HUD is now trying to sort of reel itself back from decades of policy where they're allowed public and subsidized housing to be built near or on hazardous or contaminated sites. So the Southwest waterfront was filled with low-income, moderate, and public housing going all the way to the Maryland line through Anacostia, right? So straight out East Capitol, just keep going. Straight out M Street, just keep going. All of that was public housing. Well, now there's hardly any public housing left. We have the National Stadium, we have all the restaurants, we have the theaters, we have the new waterfront that's coming in. The whole neighborhood is being transformed, right? All of that has happened as the result of the remediation of a Superfund site. Until they cleaned up that environmental threat, nobody thought about the southwestern waterfront and the southwest part of DC as an area that could be a thriving, economically viable, you know, sort of she kind of neighborhood. Nobody thought about that as the southwest waterfront. If you've lived here for any amount of time, you've seen a complete transformation. The transformation is only about a quarter of the way through. Right, there's a lot more to go. There's all kinds of new housing that's being built there. EPA used to be headquartered on the Southwest waterfront. So how many people are familiar with that area, the Southwest waterfront? You know where the Safeway supermarket is? Right adjacent to the Safeway supermarket was One Waterfront Plaza, which was the headquarters of the Environmental Protection Agency. A building that was laden with asbestos from top to bottom. The headquarters of the United States Environmental Protection Agency, and then they moved them all the way over to where they are now on Pennsylvania Avenue and 12th and 13th Street. But it was a very sick neighborhood, sick from the industrial past of the neighborhood. Once that got cleaned up and remediated, people could see an economic future for that part of the district that they never thought about before. That's happening all over the United States, but it's just a local example of something that we all see. I'm sure folks have been to Nationals games, or you've been to the theater over there, you've been to the waterfront, you've been to the new clubs and restaurants that are there. It's a hopping neighborhood. It was not always like that. It was a residential neighborhood of poor and working class people who can barely hold on as they deconstruct and demolish every unit of public housing in the District of Columbia.
Thank you for that. Well, you know, I live, as I say, in South LA, and it's in Watts, it's everywhere. My neighborhood is totally gentrified. uh, at this point in time. But I want to give a different perspective to this. Sunday, I just got back from the United Nations Habitat 3 conference in Quito, Ecuador, as a U.S. delegate to that conference, where 77 countries around the world adopted what they call the new urban agenda. And it really speaks to the fact that the world is facing massive urbanization. Over 50% of the world's population now lives in urban areas, and it's expected by 2050, 50 billion people more will be living in urban areas. We are facing massive migration. People are moving, and they're moving as political refugees, they're moving as climate refugees, they're moving as economic refugees. Here in the United States, I call them victims of sprawl, the people that are living in exurban, suburban communities are trying to get off the freeways, and everybody is moving into urban communities. And so this convening, this 5-day convening of the world was trying to figure out what the heck to do about the lack and failure and inadequate urban infrastructure, because the water, sewer, housing, jobs, everything that's needed to support our population is not adequate enough for this major urbanization. So the question becomes, what's the policy? In the U.S., are we on tape? Well, let me just put it this way. We were in the Global South, right? This conference was held in the Global South, and we were, we're Yankees of the North, Western values and cultures, and we have a long way to go to be on the same kind of stage as our counterparts in the Global South. We struggled as a U.S. platform to talk about the rights to the city, which is the rights to housing, the rights to jobs, to rights to public space. We could not endorse that as a part of the new urban agenda. So you figure that out, okay? But let me say that there are policies and strategies as students that you should think about, because it means that we have to figure out a different way of looking at building a sustainable cities. The theme of the new urban agenda is sustainable, inclusive, and participatory, and just cities. That was the theme across the world. We need to look at new policies that ensure zero displacement of long-term residents in these communities as this migration moves forward. We need to look at land banking, financing tools and policies to hold land in commons, and so that it is not driven by market sort of principles which drive people out, and only the rich can bear the opportunities to be in the better places. One of the most interesting elements, the biggest convenings and sessions and workshops was around public space and access to public space. It's just amazing to me how the world is looking at land as the commons. So I will just say that there is a relationship between the environment and gentrification, and but I think we have to look at it in the context of what's our new land use policies, what are our economic policies, how do we move away from an extractive economy to a sustainable economy.
So as one of my mentors, he doesn't know it yet, but he is a mentor, says, hashtag real talk. When we talk about urban areas, code word, predominantly African American areas, rural, predominantly low income white areas. So this urbanization that we're talking about and the displacement that's taking place is of a particular group of people. So I want to read specifically a definition that I found for gentrification. That gentrification is the buying and renovation of houses and stores in deteriorated urban neighborhoods by upper or middle income families or individuals. Often, gentrification improves property value, but also displaces low-income families when affordable housing is converted to market rate housing. So when we start talking about the displacement and what's happening and the link between gentrification and the movement of individuals, these areas that have been marginalized by design with withdrawal of economic resources, opportunities, long before they became deteriorated, polluted. Oftentimes we talk from I'm a community perspective, and I'm blessed to be able to speak for the residents of the Southeast community. So when I'm talking about community historical legacy of industrializations. There was a conversation yesterday about which came first, the industry or the community. And for people who understand community, we know community were there first before industry. And industry often here in this country was by design planned in areas of oftentimes access to the water, which during the time when our cities were being built were areas that were very poorly constructed, the swampy areas, the places that people at that time did not want to be. So when you had no choice but to be somewhere, that's where you were placed. And then on top of you then came all of the other industry. So now as the movement of these individuals come back in areas that have historically had industry in them, so as Vernice talked about the cleanup that took place at the Navy Yard because of the Superfund site, you all talked about the lead. The link between the environment and the movement of the people becomes, and our question is, the individuals who have been living in these areas, when you leave out of the area by force or not, you still carry with you the burden of the disease or the burden of the environmental health exposures and contaminants. So for me, the connection will always remain as we move people. There's no glass ceiling in any of the, not yet, who knows, when we think about the atmosphere. My training is a marine scientist, and so when we think about how contaminants move globally, eventually it will find its place and space where you are, even in these more wealthier communities. And so as we're starting to talk about gentrification, there's definitely a link that I think there's some other components that I'm sure we're going to get into about how we move from, and oftentimes using tax credits and things to clean up these neighborhoods that provide benefits for a lot of the private industry to come in and then create affordable housing, and how that affordable housing then shifts because of things such as the average median income as you start increasing the value of the lands. And so where your affordable housing income at one time may have been 500, once the value of the land begins to increase around, that affordable mean income or average mean income is raised to 1,600. And so who's able to afford to live there begins to dictate potentially, the characteristics and makeup of the community.
Yeah. If I can also just add to this, though, but there's just no place for, just as an urban planner and people who think about how you build cities and how they should be constituted, there's no place for us to logically go in the context of resource constraints, right? Limited water and what we're doing with our energy system. I mean, we're what is it, about 2 times past the holding capacity of our consumption of every natural resource that we can possibly imagine. So we've got to figure out a way to build cities smarter, to make sure that they're integrated both in race and class and integrated on types of uses, It's going to be dense, but it's got to be real. I mean, this is talk about real talk. So where are they trying to push us to? You know, at the end of the day, it's just not going to make economic sense. It's not going to make environmental sense for us to be anywhere but with a plan that is about sustainable, resilient communities and social and economic integration.
Absolutely. And Erica, from what you guys said is really rich. So I'm going to tell a little story, and I want to use your hashtag. Is it okay? Hashtag real talk?
It's not mine, it's Mustafa
Mustafa Ali,
Ali.
oh,
Is
for
it
the
coming?
conference plans, Mustafa's not able to come. He's being held up at the office at EPA. So he asked me to let you all know that he sends his regrets.
Thank you for the
Yeah,
full
that's-
But that's
disclosure.
definitely not
Mustafa's
mine. That is
Okay.
my,
Hashtag real talk.
yes. my
Hashtag real
mentor.
talk. Mustafa, I'm taking it if you're listening. Um, and what I got from this panel was really a rich, so I want to tie what both of you guys said, because you talked about these issues on a global level, and you talked about movement, which was really interesting to me because, as I stated earlier, I lived for 2 years in Ghana, Accra, West Africa. I lived in Osu, which is right in the middle of the city. Has anyone ever been there before? Okay, so you may be able to really picture what I'm about to talk about here. There's a place, the oldest part of the city is called Jamestown. And if you are a worker in Accra, you know that if you work probably just about anywhere close to the center city, you would sit in hours of traffic. And if there wasn't traffic, it may only take you 5 or 10 minutes to get home. But because of the way the city was built, because the colonizers, the English, didn't envision the natives driving and having cars. So they only built, especially the oldest parts of the city, they only built those city streets with the capacity to carry the cars of the colonizers. So I mean, I think that's a really good example in a global context how we've created these developments, through colonialism, through white supremacy, through capitalistic exploitation. We have built environments that weren't conducive for the growth of people, the growth of human beings, even the ambitions of those human beings. And so linking this to gentrification, what's happening in Accra, most of the new development is being built outside the city. They're still pretty close to where many of the jobs are in Jamestown and in the older parts of the city, but they're insanely expensive. They're insanely expensive, which to me isn't gentrification the way that we think of it. But I think, for someone like me, I had a decent apartment. I lucked out when I was living in Accra. I was paying $800 to live in the city center, which was really lucky for it. I really lucked out. But most people who want to live in these parts of this, in that part of the city in particular, that doesn't have all of the environmental degradation because of the pollution, because of the traffic and the fumes and everything like that, you have to pay an arm and a leg. So I'm really glad that you brought up Ecuador as one example, because this is definitely something that has been structured not just in the United States but in other parts of the world, and they mainly impact people in the global South and mainly people of color. So now I'm going to take it back to let me make sure I'm not mixing names here. What Vernice was talking about when she talked about the local Southwest and how that community was neglected for so long environmentally, but also economically, by how when those environmental issues were cleared up, the community was able to prosper. So that's a good segue into the next question. And the next question is, how has the underdevelopment of poor communities of color impacted or rather hindered their ability to take advantage of development opportunities in the current economy? Should I repeat that? Did y'all get that? That was a loaded question. Maybe I'll just say it a little bit more succinctly. Because many of these communities have been marginalized economically, environmentally, and in other ways, how has that impacted the members of those communities? How has it impacted their ability to, A, stay in their communities, but 2, take part in the economic development that's now happening around them?
So it's a tale of sort of two approaches, right? So you have longstanding historic communities of color. So as I said, I'm originally from Harlem, New York, and I sort of think of Harlem as ground zero for the conversation about gentrification and displacement. when I was growing up in Harlem in the 1960s, it had the largest concentration of people of African descent of any place outside of continental Africa in the world, besides Africa. More black people, more people of African descent lived in Harlem, 350 to 550,000 people in the 1960s to the 1980s. And then the population began to migrate to other parts of New York City, mostly because the housing stock was being abandoned by the folks who owned it, right? So the people who lived in it were not necessarily the people who owned it, but extraordinary architecture and extraordinary housing stock. In the 1970s, New York City was the sole owner of most of the tax foreclosed housing in New York City. And they were selling those brownstones and those homes in the community that I lived in for $1. Do I wish that, except that I was in middle school at the time, do I wish that, that I had said to my mom, we really need to sort of get in on this. The thing that you couldn't do, though, you could buy the house, but if you were African American or Latino, you couldn't access the capital through the banks to be able to renovate or restore that house, right? So you could buy a dilapidated house, but you could not access the capital to build it up or to make it livable or to really bring it back to its level of grandeur. And most of the architecture is really, really, really extraordinary. And so people said, well, that's if I can't access capital to be able to renovate or restore, then I'm going to look someplace else. And so the population began to migrate. They migrated really far to another borough in New York City, to Kings County or Brooklyn, which now has the largest population of people of African, the largest other population of people of African descent outside of continental Africa. But that struggle around just maintaining the communities where you lived, right where you were, where you built institutions, where you had churches that had existed for a century or more, was really hard to maintain because people couldn't access the capital to build businesses, to maintain businesses. It was the family network. So if you had family resources or you could tap into family resources, you might be able to buy a house or you might be able to start a business or maintain a business, but you could not through the normal networks of capital. You could not get into that. And so the community declined. And then we were besieged by the crack epidemic in the 1980s. And that just made life absolutely unbearable. And it was during the crack epidemic and the reign of Rudy Giuliani as the mayor that, and somebody saying, I would like to marry you, but I'm not living in New York City, that brought me here. But I saw the sort of the cycle of disinvestment. So people were on their knees in terms of the crime issues, in terms of the quality of life issues. And then we had a plethora of environmental assaults. I mean, major, not things that were hard to perceive. Like lead poisoning is something that a lot of people know is there, but it's really hard to see it, and you really have to go looking for it. But a sewage treatment plant that treats 180 million gallons of raw sewage a day, that's not hard to see, right? Bus depots and transportation modes that go up and down and through your community, marine transfer stations, incinerators, power plants, we had all of that in our community, but we still didn't have access to the things that would allow us to be able to make the community more sustainable. So all of this sort of came to a head in the 1990s. We started a nonprofit organization. We sued the city of New York, got them to spend $55 million to fix the sewage treatment plant. But what really put that in the forefront of our minds is that we joined forces with Columbia University School of Public Health, my alma mater, and found out that we had the highest rate of asthma of any community in the United States, the highest incidence of asthma, and the highest rate of premature death from asthma of any community in the Western Hemisphere. The Western Hemisphere, right? Not just the United States, but the Western Hemisphere. You know, Mexico City is in the Western Hemisphere, and it has really, really, really bad air quality, but it couldn't hold a candle to the air quality that we had or how bad it was. So all of these things were converging. So we decided that in order to have the kind of community that we wanted to have, with the kind of quality of life that we needed, and the level of public health attainment that we wanted to have, we were going to have to fight for our own community, come up with our own vision, articulate the vision, I got on the planning board, something that I had been loath to do, but I finally succumbed and said, okay, I'm going to be on the planning board, where all the action was happening. And in fact, we had a gargantuan battle with Donald Trump around a land use issue that we lost. But we had to take hold of the vision and the process for development and growth in our own community in order to make it livable, right? To get rid of the bus depot, to do away with the marine transfer station, to get the city and the state to fix the air quality issues at the sewage treatment plant. And once we fought all those battles, which took us about 15 years, on Tuesday, we celebrated the 29th anniversary of our organization. I was at a conference with EPA, and my colleague, Adrian, is here. Adrian is our federal policy director. You heard Adrian on an earlier panel, and she works here. Oh, she's coming after me. She works here in Washington, D.C. We were at an EPA conference, but we have fought for more than 35 years for the vision of our community. And a former board member of our organization, We Act for Environmental Justice, she said one day at a board meeting, Norma Ramos, Norma said, who knew that we were doing all this work all this time to make it easier for Columbia University? So Columbia University, also my alma mater, is right next to where I went to undergrad and graduate school, is right next to, it's really in the middle of Harlem, right? If you know sort of the grid of New York City, 116th Street, no matter how you slice it, no matter where you put it, is in the middle of Harlem, except Columbia believes they're in a place called Morningside Heights, a fictional community that they created so that they wouldn't say that the campus was in Harlem. Now the university is building a new campus, right? But when I was an undergrad, you were told not to go off campus. You were told not to go north of campus because that's where those scary people were. Well, I was from north of campus, so in freshman orientation, I'm going, so what? What's going to happen to you when you go over there? I just want somebody to tell me, what do you think is going to happen? Now the university is building a new campus in Harlem proper on the Hudson River that is going to occupy more square footage than the World Trade Center. Won't be nearly as tall, so that gives you a sense of how vast it's going to be, right? That's what's happening for folks. You have to have your own vision. You have to fight for the vision. You have to train everybody and build their capacity to be at the decision-making tables. You have to run people for elective office. You have to be on the planning board. You have to control the process of land use, right? That's how you control your future. And we did that. Took us 35 years to do it, but we did that. But now that we've done that, it's no longer a majority African American or Latino community. So we did all that fighting so that other people could come and bear the benefits of living in that extraordinary place. That was not the plan, right? And so we got to go back and figure out, even when you do all of those things, you still somehow lose control of your community. And you have to have a longer vision for what is the game, right? What is it that you ultimately hope to have?
I want to add one thing about when we think about underdevelopment, that it doesn't necessarily always mean just an economic underdevelopment. So when you take resources out of a community, think about the schools. So now think about the lack of education that community members are getting or have access to, and the lack of skills that community members have access to then be able to be a part of a working environment within the community if you don't have the skills. And oftentimes now with gentrification, especially in the green fields, a lot of our communities don't have the skill set to be certified with regards to a lot of the rebuilding, revitalization that is taking place because of the lack of skills. So when we think about underdevelopment, it doesn't always necessarily mean the economic divestment, but also think about how that infiltrates into the other aspects of the environment. And for us in our coalition, when we talk about the environment, we're talking about the whole of the community. So it's not just the natural environment that involves the toxics and exposure to those chemicals, but it's also that cultural environment that Vernice talked about with regards to Harlem, the social environment, lack of resources, lack of access to health care, of course, the political environment. Many of you have the opportunity to shape policy, create policy, fight for better policy in communities, and then, of course, social, economic, cultural, environmental. I'm drawing a blank.
Political?
Yes, political. And so how that underdevelopment hits all aspects of those components of the environment become very important. Because sometimes we just think about things in silos, but we don't live our lives in silos. We live a very full life. Even in the more marginalized communities, it's still that a community that is of somewhat of a whole that just needs to be better supported.
Yeah. So let me leverage some of that, what both of you mentioned. One, if you don't have money, if you are quote unquote poor, you know that it impacts your health, it impacts the environment, it impacts your housing circumstances, your ability to educate your children, your access to good foods. You know, it's the pits, right? So we know money matters. But what you need to recognize is that most people think folks are poor because of, their personal lack of something. But the fact is that poverty exists because of public policy.
Yes.
It has been public policy that's created poor communities, poor households. It was our transportation policies in 1956, which built the roads to allow for white flight. It was our housing policies, right, FHA and others, that required, that said that, okay, you can move to the suburbs, but if you're black or other people of color, you can't move to the suburbs. You can't get mortgages. You can't get mortgages to move into these places. So you were trapped into places that were abandoned. It has to do with the banking policies, where in fact you can't reinvest. You can't buy a house even in the inner city, and you can't improve the house that you do have. So there's a process of decline that takes place. There are private sector policies, where businesses moved out. So poverty wasn't, is intentional. It is intentional, and so it is your responsibility and ours to look at the current policies of today to make sure that we reverse those trends and that we improve our environment and our health and our educational opportunities. And one of the things that I think I take optimism from is the fact that there is a new economy, and there are people who are driving a vision for a new economy and opportunities to figure out policies in a new kind of way. And that's the work of Emerald Cities, which is to particularly say, we need, about $2 trillion of new investments in our communities to build resilient infrastructure, to rebuild our energy systems, our water systems, our sewer systems, our food systems. And a lot of that's becoming sort of decentralized networked economies. That's sort of the vision of the future, where we're able to begin to build community-owned, community-controlled, we'll regain our communities. So how do we make sure those investments, that we own a piece of that investment? And that's what we're doing. Public benefit, which is from our public dollars, needs to benefit us directly. Local hire, local procurement, creating community wealth. That's what we need to do to make sure that we've got the economic foundation for the future.
Can I just add one other thing to that? Just a thought of how we think about low income. And when we think about low income and we associate it, 10 minutes or 10 seconds?
Minutes.
Okay. Think about poverty with low income. It doesn't mean that people don't have access to money. I'm going to read you a statistic specifically for this, I'm going to use code word, urban population. So the urban buying power, and this was done by the University of Georgia's Center for Economic Growth, the urban buying power is projected to reach $1.2 trillion this year, and $1.4 trillion by 2020. 2020 is significant because we talk about EJ 2020. That is a 275% growth since 1990, when this urban buying power was only $320 billion. So when we're thinking about low income, we have to sort of step outside of the box of what that really means and understand that low income is not really connected to poverty, but as the doctor was saying, that the poverty is connected to the policies.
That's a great segue. All of those, thank you actually for those responses to those questions. I know we can talk about this all day. I know I can, but I know we have a limited amount of time. So we're going to switch gears slightly, because I think part of the questions framed what we're talking about here and what the issues are. And I think the panelists did a beautiful job of that. Next, we want to shift to solutions. So I have 3 questions that are solution focused. Okay. I have 1 question for each of you. Okay. There's actually a 2-part question. So first, and I want to ask that you guys take 1 minute or less if you can to try to answer this question. Okay. I know it's difficult. First, I'm going to ask Vernice a question. What is the power of community ownership and engagement in urban development and finding solutions to environmental harm? So that has to do, but then I'm also going to add a second question.
Okay.
For young law students, like many of those who are in the audience, how can they get involved and rally behind those efforts?
So the nonprofit that I mentioned to you, we started the organizing around that in 1986. We formed the nonprofit in 1988. And in doing the work and doing the research and seeing what was going on in the community, it became clear that the thing that had really driven us to the edge was a lack of understanding of the local land use and zoning process in New York City. And it was so severe because all of these inequities are baked into the local land use and zoning process. If you want to know how to build resilient communities, one of the first things you should do is at least attend the local planning board meeting, and you should try to get on the local planning board if you're really interested in it. I would say that you need to really study land use law. Right? If you're interested in environmental issues, you need to study land use law, and you need to really understand it, because they really are intricately connected. So we did this organizing for 10 years, and I decided that nobody in our community really understood the process, and we kept being run over by it. So I decided to go to planning school, and I said, somebody's got to understand what the process is, because we will forever be behind the 8 ball. People need to understand the process, master the process, be in the process, and then try to drive the process and reshape the process. If the process is not working, then reconstruct the process. That's been done time and time and time again. We can do that. Everybody can do that. You do not need a degree in planning to understand it. It helps, but you don't need that, right? And you can train people. So you as law students can train people through clinics, through volunteer activity, through the places that you work, through service in the public sector. You can train folk on how to really understand and master these processes. The same is true for environmental issues. Though she has a PhD, she works with a lot of people who may not even be high school graduates. You should hear them talk about the environment and environmental policy, the river, the riptide, the currents, the port, how that impacts the life of a community. You do not have to be highly trained to understand it. You just have to know that you're about to be run over by that truck, and you better understand what's going on.
Thank you. Erica, my question to you is, what are the indicators of meaningful community involvement, and how can law students maybe not lead in some spaces, but get behind the efforts that are already taking place in the communities and support those efforts?
So I'm coming to sort of like a battle within myself, because I'm getting tired of sort of hearing this term meaningful engagement, and really what that means is I'm trying to digest that, because it's not just another public meeting that's at the correct time, that has the proper number of babysitters and all the things necessary to support the community, but it's about actively being involved in the decision-making, in the planning, then the decision-making, then the implementation of any of those plans, and all of those plans from the beginning to the end, for me, is what meaningful involvement is. As far as law school students, you all are in a prime time right now to get your hands and feet wet in the communities around this school. I would say step out of your silos in your law organizations, go into the communities and listen. Ask the community, how can we help? Tell them what your expertise is, and then let them tell you how they want to use your expertise. I say this because I graduated from the College of William and Mary. As many of you know, William and Mary has the oldest law program. Our community has been fortunate to partner with the Virginia Coastal Policy Clinic. It's not a litigation clinic, but it is allowing us as communities to understand the laws in the community around land use. And so there are wonderful opportunities now to go in, get your feet wet, get your hands wet, and be active. And it still has some real implications, and can really have some great support in the communities around the school here.
Great advice from both of the panelists. Our last question is to Denise, and it's a little bit loaded. It's a little bit loaded. It's very interesting. I really like this question because and I'll tell you why. I like this question because it could potentially give people No pressure, but it could potentially give people a framework of, how to create policies or how to get involved on projects that actually work. So my question to you is, can you discuss an example of a successful community involvement project around this issue of gentrification? And we're going to measure success, we're going to measure the success of the program, one, that it doesn't displace people, but it actually involves the community, and the community can develop together without pushing people out. Are there any programs or initiatives that exist out there? Can you discuss it? And what advice would you give to some of the people in this room who may want to rally behind something like that? How do they find it? What does it look like? Again, no pressure, but
In 60 seconds. Okay. Well, one example is a organization in Los Angeles, South Los Angeles, that's really dealing with this issue of gentrification where we work and live. We're pressured by downtown expansion going south into Los Angeles and USC expansion going north, and they're creating this one mega downtown and pushing low-income immigrant communities out. And so, SAGE is a coalition of organizations that have actually did everything that I talked about earlier, which is to create a zero displacement zone, organized, trained residents in the community about land use laws, and presented themselves at every public hearing possible every time USC wanted some kind of expansion or, taking public roads and turning them into private roads. Every time there was some movement for a land use right, we were there fighting that, and we raised a couple of about $20 million to create a land bank. But we were also teaching legal clinics on tenants' rights and withholding, funds, because what landlords were doing were essentially not improving, the property so that they can force residents out so that they can get market rate for the housing. So we had folks actually put their money into escrow and to fight these kinds of moves by landlords. So those are some of the things that can be done. But one of the things I wanted to really push out here is about, one of the things we have to do is just look at constitutional law. And I want to just tell you guys, go to a piece that I just wrote about what abolitionists can teach us about climate change. Because, we had a 300-year history to dismantle the slave economy. And we're in the same kind of place right now where we're trying to dismantle the fossil fuel economy, where, in fact, the extraction of natural resources and the exploitation of nature and the exploitation of human capital is actually baked into our Constitution. And, in order for us to unlock the slave economy, we had to change the Constitutional. We had to, institute the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment. Right now, our Constitution allows for corporations to exploit, our natural environment as right. And we have to, as lawyers, if that's your field here, need to really figure out what that's about. There is a movement in the Global South called the rights of nature. And we need to be a part of that so that we can really create a new kind of society where we are part of the ecosystem and not one to dominate and exploit it and everybody in it, everything in it.
Thank you so much. So that concludes this part of the panel, or this part of the event. Please give our panelists a round of applause. Please. Thank you for all of your hard work. Secondly, I want you guys to give yourself a round of applause. Give yourself a round of applause. These are tough topics, and you guys listen, but I just want to note right before we close, I think we're getting pushed off the stage.
Q&A.
Oh, Q&A. Oh, so we don't have to end. Yay, okay. So, got a quick question here?
Yeah, we do have like 10 or 15 minutes for Q&A,
10 or 15
and then
minutes,
after
okay.
that, while that's going on, we do have some of our organizers passing out some facilitated discussion questions to work out in breakout groups afterwards for about 10 minutes too.
Nice. Okay, question here. Please state your name and your background and ask your question.
My name's Haley. I'm a third year here at Georgetown Law. Grew up in Baltimore County, went to South Carolina for marine science, and aspiring environmental attorney. My question is, I care a lot about climate change, of course, as many of us in the room do, and a big movement in the land use space is this new urbanism movement towards, like you were talking about, sort of community contained places with, you don't have to drive your car far, far away. It's more, everything is closer and the carbon footprint is smaller. And I feel like in theory that's such a great idea, but you're going to end up displacing so many communities, or at least gentrifying, maybe without displacing, if there's some way to do that. So I was wondering if you have very specific ideas for gentrifying seems inevitable, but without that displacement factor, like we saw in Southwest DC. So if you could just talk for a minute about if you have any specific ideas about how we address some of those climate change issues without leading to that displacement.
Okay, can we have one answer so that we can get as many questions as possible?
Oh, my goodness. Well, so we have two track thinking, right? New urbanism and smart growth. Both of which are inherently absent of any justice and equity analysis baked in. So we have this big move to, as Denise said, to sort of bring the population in, right? Because a city is thought to be a really good model for sort of an eco model, right? The problem is that the cities are not empty. And the thinking and that analysis of new urbanism and smart growth is that you are bringing people in from the suburbs and the exurbs into places where people do not live. But people do live there, right? So if you want to bring people in from the suburbs of New York to reduce the traffic, or in Los Angeles, how many people live in LA proper?
About 3 million.
So there's 3 million people that already live there. There's 8 million people that already live in New York City. So in order for that model to work, either the city's going to have to get bigger, or it's going to have to get taller and more dense, which is what a lot of people talk about. I just don't think you can put any more people in New York City. I could never imagine living there again. Never imagine living there again. I lived there for 40 years. I don't think 8 million people are meant to live in that smaller geographic space together. It makes everybody crazy, right? But the notion that the cities are empty is a major fallibility of those concepts and constructs. And so here's the challenge that I have. We're happy if everybody wants to come to the city. I know why everybody wants to live in a district. It's the place to live. If you live here, if you live in this metropolitan area, the district is the place to be. All roads lead to DC. But there's a lot of black people that already live here. So if you want to come, that's wonderful. If you want to stay after law school, that's wonderful. But you're going to have to live with black people, right? Not instead of black people, or Latino people if you're someplace, or Asian American, or Native American, or whatever it is. And that piece seems to be missing, and we don't seem to want to talk about it, right? I'm all for more people coming, though. That's why I live in the suburbs. And yes, I'm staying in the suburbs. I'm an environmentalist that breaks all the rules. I'm not coming back to the city. I'm not coming, right? But the blue line comes 4 miles from where I live, right? So I can be in the district anytime I want to be. But what I think is really fundamentally unjust is this notion that in order to achieve some level of environmental parity or this perfect ecosystem, that poor people, people of color, working class folk have to be displaced in order for that model to work. If there's no justice, right, this is not about no peace, but if there's no justice, there's no sustainability, right? You can't get to one place without the other.
Thank you. Do we have another question?
Yeah, really happy we're talking about land use today. My actual question was about the suburbs, and especially places that have a history of low density exclusionary zoning. I'm curious if your organizations have, in fact, had either relationships or negotiations with municipal leaders from suburbs as a way to reach, regional affordable housing goals and other such policies.
Who wants to take this one?
I'm looking at Denise, and she's looking down there.
I was just going to say we haven't, but what I did want to say was that we're talking about the culture. Residents in the community that I live in have been over, some of them can generationally trace their lineage over 150, 200 years from this one place. You all saw the documentary that Leslie talked about earlier. Why would we want to leave home? And it goes back to Vernice's point about it's not about displacement, but how to come and be a part of that was already there.
Yeah. So we actually do work in, with with LA County, well, it's actually LA County and Cuyahoga County. These are county jurisdictions that are more suburban and even semi-rural in context, and they operate as, you know, a different kind of jurisdiction, and having different conversations with them about how to build sustainable communities. And what's quite interesting is that gentrification is something that we're trying to stop, but I'm gonna just tell y'all, Black and brown folk are already gentrified, and they're in these suburban communities, and they're increasingly isolated from now jobs that are coming back into the community and transportation systems. And so we are starting to think about how to, you know, address the fact where people are, how do we build a whole new economy for them that is going to be a different kind of sustainable economy. So it's really looking at that second rung community and developing a whole new economic model for them. Going in the future, and I'm just because I'm barely a week back, you know, there's been a whole conversation in this global context about a rural, peri-urban, and urban model, and really beginning to really think about those three segments and how they're connected and what we need to do at each level, each tier of the sort of spatial dimension of urbanization.
And if I could just recommend a book for you all to read, it's a book entitled Root Shock by Dr. Mindy Thompson Fullalove. Mindy is a psychiatrist that teaches in the medical school at Columbia University. And Mindy wrote this just extraordinary book that really helped my thinking around my own work extraordinarily. And it is this, that when you, so what Denise just talked about is this notion of churning, right? Population churning. So the white folks are coming in from the suburbs, the people of color going out. The poverty rate is higher in the suburbs now than it is in the central city as a result of that process, right? But when people leave those places, the psychosocial impact of moving from those places is devastating. It's devastating. And even though people may move to a neighborhood or a community that you might think has a better quality of life, the relationship to place is an emotional relationship, a cultural relationship, a physical, a religious relationship, right? And when you move people from that place and they're no longer together, which is a big part of what happened post-Katrina, it changes everything in your life in a way that you may not be able to identify or put back together so that you can be whole wherever you live. That physical place is everything. And though I don't live in Harlem anymore, everything about me, everything about me, from my DNA to everything that I carry with me every day, is about having grown up in that community and lived there for 40 years. Everything that I am is about being a part of that place.
Can I add something there? Thank you. No? Okay. Well, I mean, one big question people had when Ferguson was taking place is, why do you have a community that is mainly African Americans, but the civic participation is so low? And a lot of it goes back to what you just said, because Ferguson is a suburban community that has been impacted by gentrification. A lot of the people that live in Ferguson now came from St. Louis City, and taking them out of that community made them feel like, what, you know, this is not my community. This is a place where I rent a house because I can afford it. This is not where I'm from. I don't care about the civic, you know, happenings of this community. So I think that's what you just said is a good example of why the answer to that question.
Yeah, and I would also add that, you know, I created a bit of a controversy in the affordable housing community, and I'm a houser, did affordable housing development for many years, and just really talked about placemaking being critical for climate resilience, right? Because when we talk about Sandy and we talk about what's happening, you know, we are our own first responders, our communities, and that social capital that really is more important than anything else. And so there are folks in the affordable housing community that's trying to move us out. They're, the voucher program, which is, you know, pushing us into so we can get economic mobility and educational opportunities and so forth. And I'm asking folks to really rethink that, because we go into these places, if we can get into them, if anybody's going to accept these vouchers, and there's no social cohesion. There is nobody helping us knowing that we're there, caring about where the, and that is, you know, in the context of climate change and
That's exactly
extreme
right.
weather and disasters, not a good thing.
And the one thing I wanted to say is exactly where Denise left off. So having lived in the suburbs now for almost 20 years. So I live in the most affluent African-American community in the United States, Bowie, Maryland, and Prince George's County. We are the economic driver. It's my friend Dorothy Morrison, who works at the Maryland Department of the Environment, and Adrian. We all live in Bowie, Maryland. It is not a community, right? It is a series of never-ending subdivisions with really beautiful houses. I have a yard that's so big, it's bigger than any park I ever had to grow up in when I grew up in Harlem. That's why I bought the house, because I have my own park, 3 of them, in fact, all contiguous to my house. But it is not a community, right? If I want community, I have to go back home to New York. My hairdresser is still in New York, right? The people who tailor my clothes are still in New York. When I go home, I have to go to the West Indian restaurant that I love to eat at because I can't get that where I live in the suburbs. It is not a community, right? So community is not about the structure. It's not about wealth. It's not about material accumulation. A community is about a set of relationships between people and the place where they are. And I just want to say that, you know, that moving out is not necessarily moving up, right? It's just moving out.
Hi, my name's Raisa. I'm a third-year law student here, and I know absolutely nothing about EJ. So you'll have to forgive the ignorance of this question. So I know a little bit about admin law, and whenever a governmental agency wants to develop something or change something, they have to do a cost-benefit analysis. And when we talk about businesses and wealthy people going into lower income neighborhoods, right? They're there to try and gain some like economic development. And so my question is, how do we incentivize environmental and economic justice and equality when sometimes it feels like sometimes it feels like the interests are different, right? Like one is about saving money or making money, and the other is about preserving justice. So even though those things may not be divorced from each other, what ways can we incentivize or encourage people to think about these things, even when it is not the most economically efficient thing to do?
So is Cynthia Ferguson still in the room? Did y'all hear did Cynthia speak earlier? From the Department of Justice?
No, she didn't speak. She just attended.
So, so they just did something extraordinary at the Department of Justice. So they just settled the litigation against Volkswagen for VW for you know, operating cars and selling cars where they manipulated the catalytic converters so they were not meeting air quality standards. And so the Department of Justice just settled a multi-billion-dollar settlement with Volkswagen about that. And what they built into the settlement was that some portion of that money, billions with a B and an S, would go to communities that were disproportionately impacted by air pollution, particularly highway and traffic corridor, truck corridor routes, that communities would get targeted investments of some portion of that settlement in the billions, right? Took them a really long time. I bet people have been wondering, what are they doing with that settlement? What are they doing over there at DOJ? How long is this going to take? They worked to structure that. Cynthia was a part of that process, and her unit, the Environment and Natural Resources Division at the Justice Department. You can make it work if you want to make it work, right? You can incentivize what you want to incentivize, or you can allow the law to roll as it is and make it an instrument of people's displacement or harm or inequity. But you can also bake that into the process. Just like the negatives are baked in, the positives and the affirmations can be baked in too. You can do a lot of creative things with supplemental environmental projects in terms of settling projects, how you construct the settlement agreement, what you require folks to do in terms of making sure that those conditions don't repeat themselves over and over. There are lots of things you can do. Environmental benefits agreements, good neighbor agreements, port agreements. There's all kinds of things that can be done. But the law is not static, right? The law is what you make it and how you interpret it.
And one of the other tools that's being used, and I'm trying to figure out which, I think it was in Natural Capitalism, and there's a couple of other authors, environmental authors, that are really talking about life cycle accounting. You know, this whole notion of cost benefit is just a bunch of bull, because they don't include in cost benefit the externalities
Yes.
of their developments, you know, the environmental externalities, or the spillage, and, you know, or that we've got to protect our oil, so we're spending money on military. These are all costs. All right, and then once you start using a life cycle accounting methodology, the benefit of preserving the environment becomes more advantageous. So there are folks that are moving in that direction.
I have one really brief question, and this I think is mostly towards Vernice, but also Denise. Denise. You've both worked a lot in the area of, we've talked about the commons and growing the local economy so that that wealth and ownership really stays in the communities that we're looking at. So how we're improving and adding investment and ownership over over these sort of impact developments and sustainable development. And I was wondering if you could speak a bit to education and employment opportunities that have come out of that so that the wealth is retained in the communities that we're seeing these changes.
Denise, I'm just going to punt that to you because I think Sage did some of the most creative, groundbreaking work in that area that I'm aware of.
So let me see. So you talk about wealth creation, right? And how to build. Well, first of all, wealth creation is really how do you have an equity stake? It's not just about jobs and education, but how do you have an equity stake in whatever the economic enterprise is? And I think we're still at the cutting edge of figuring that out. One of our sites in the Bronx actually are partners with the Bronx Cooperative Development Initiative, BCDI. We're trying to look at, and Hunts Point as well, is really trying to figure out how to decentralize energy, how to get off the grid and create community-owned and community-controlled energy systems. And part of that is to lower the costs of energy, improving access to clean energy, but also being able to create jobs in the construction of this and maintaining this this new energy infrastructure, and then having resources and revenues that are made, because with the savings, how does that come back into a community fund that can then begin to fund other kinds of sustainable development projects? So that's one example of what we're doing. Another quick one is in the East Bay, San Francisco East Bay. We're taking anchor institution strategies, so hospitals, particularly under the Affordable Care Act, is now required, they have reinvestment requirements. They have to actually go out and put health needs assessment, talk to people in the community, and reinvest in the upstream social, economic, and environmental determinants of health. And so we've got Kaiser, for example, that's made a commitment to go 100% sustainable in terms of their food and their supply, and to create most of that in the local economy. So we're building and trying to build a whole different local sustainable food economy, deconstructing the global food system, or at least the regional system, to be more local, to be healthier, growing food co-ops along the entire supply chain from the production side. So we're doing aquaponics, you know, and changing the sort of technology of food production to the processing, to the retail side of this. They need soups, they need all kinds of things. So, I mean, those are the kinds of things that we're doing, and it's all experimental, but we're pretty excited about these sort of new kind of reinvestment strategies and visions.
And in the energy sector, just one. So I'm thinking that Adrienne is going to talk about some of the climate equity and climate justice work that that she is a part of. But we SCIO, a colleague and I wrote a report for the Town Creek Foundation in Maryland called Planning for Climate and Energy Equity in Maryland, and it really looked at identifying the opportunities for equity, job creation, green energy economy, switching and coming out of the fossil fuel economy into the green economy in Maryland as part of our ability to enforce the Maryland Greenhouse Gas Reduction Act, which is going to be the principal legislative and policy avenue that Maryland uses to get online and be compliant with the Clean Power Plan. There are enormous opportunities in Maryland, but right now those opportunities opportunities are not being afforded to diverse populations, to poor folks, to the agricultural economy, which is, you know, 1/2 of the economy in Maryland is still an agricultural-based economy. So how do you make sure that you drive those new green energy benefits to the folks that most need them? So the report really looks at all the instruments we have, but, you know, one thing that really jumped out at me was the need for aggregate solar. So if you live in a multifamily unit housing in Maryland, you are not able to put solar on your house. If you don't own your house and you rent your house, or you live in an apartment building and you rent an apartment, you are not able to access the benefits of solar energy and solar power. In Baltimore City, that's particularly stark because Baltimore City has one of the highest rates for energy of any city in the United States. It also has one of the highest rates of poverty of any city in the United States. So people are paying through the nose and the eyeballs for energy, but they cannot get into the solar and alternative energy economy because they mostly are not homeowners. Right? So, or they live in houses, but they don't own their houses. So that's just one instrument that when we look at the notion of aggregate solar, how do people who live in multi-unit apartment buildings, how do people who live in a community be able to develop community solar so that folks can tap into that? That's just one avenue that we can really drive new economic benefit, employment opportunity, the manufacture of community solar. How do we do that? That's just one tiny aspect of what is going to be a booming green energy economy in the state of Maryland.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much again to our wonderful panel and our moderator. Thank you. So at this point, for the next 10 minutes or so, we're hoping to break out to breakout groups. Sorry. So if you're at a table that isn't full, if you can move to a more full table. And we have the next 10 minutes to kind of talk about the issues and framework that the panel just went over. We've made optional discussion questions. If you would like to follow these, you don't have to. And then in about 10 minutes, we'll check in again. And if any groups want to share what they've discussed, then that would be great. Thank you. And after that, we'll take about a 15-minute break and then have our final panel.
No problem.
I'm
Thank you
sorry
for your
for all the
question.
lipstick and everything.
No worries.
Right?
No worries. I can still read it.
Thank you. I'm
Thank you.
glad to be here. Thanks. Okay. It was quite amazing. You know, with 45,000 people from around the world, and the city kind of handled it very nicely. But they had one amazing thing was called City of Lights, where the French worked with the Ecuadorians and just lit up like these 6 churches, animated light shows, and the place was just packed. It wasn't even with tourists, with all the locals. It was quite amazing. So it was an interesting experience, especially when I was sitting at the U.S. desk.
How are you?
Glad everybody was able to make it.
How you doing?
I'm blessed. How are you?
So long since I saw you.
Yeah, 12 hours. I'm here, Wood. I'm Jessica Granis. I'm going to moderate this panel. Nice to meet
It's a
you.
Long Island iced tea.
It's
We
gonna
do
be
have to talk,
cozy
though.
'cause there's so many of us.
Okay.
So
You
just
go. You
grab
say
a
you go to bed
seat
early,
wherever you're
don't
most
you?
comfortable.
Well, last night I knew I had to
I
get
didn't
up
get
early
any
to work
water.
on those times.
But you got a glass right there, and I can bring
I
you
would
up.
say phone calls to about 11 at night.
Yes,
You
sir.
want a cookie?
I know I saw you call,
Good. Thank
you
you
so
so
but I
much.
was already.
May want to later
Jessica
though.
Granis
Yeah.
Till
with
like
Georgetown Climate Center. And I'm
generally
gonna
12, 1
moderate the
o'clock.
panel
See, I get up at
today,
4.
so
And
just
if I
wanted to
go
say
to bed
hi.
early, if I
I'm
go to bed
Mustafa.
early,
Yes, sir.
4 or 5 o'clock in the morning, I'm wide awake. Yes. Good. Thank you, sir. Same here.
Adrian, nice to meet you. Because I go work out at 5.
Yes, sir. Okay.
And then by 5 p.m., I'm dead.
Okay, thank you everybody so much for being here for our third and final panel today. I'm going to introduce Jessica Granis, who is from our very own Georgetown Climate Center and has graciously offered her time to moderate our panel of esteemed panelists, who I will let her introduce, and they can tell you a little bit about their work. But thanks to everybody who made today a success, and we hope you stick around afterwards for Q&A, for more breakout sessions, and for some wine and networking after the event.
Thank you. So hi all, my name is Jessica Granis. I manage the Georgetown Climate Center's adaptation program, where we work with states and localities to help them prepare for the impacts of climate change and reduce emissions. And I'm really excited today to be able to moderate this esteemed and very large panel. So I'm gonna try to keep people on time so we can hear from everybody, and we gotta get some folks out of here to catch a plane at 4:45. So the Climate Center works on these issues of communities facing disproportionate impacts from climate change. There are certain communities that are on the front lines of climate change impacts, communities of color, low-income communities, the elderly, the very young, and people with disabilities and illnesses face disproportionate risks to the impacts of climate change. And communities across the country are grappling with how do we ensure that our responses are equitable? How do we ensure an equitable planning process? And how do we ensure that the policies that we're adopting to prepare for climate change will not put people at increased risk or harm them more than the climate change impacts that they're already going to see. So I'm really excited today to hear from the panelists. We have Melissa Diaz in the audience, who leads our work on equity, and we are in the process now of pulling together a resource on our adaptation clearinghouse and equity portal to help communities and community-based organizations understand how climate change is going to increase these risks and how they can respond. So I want to introduce people quickly, but then I'm going to turn it over to each of you to give us a few words about who you are and tell us something that we can't learn from your bio, and give us a quick snapshot of how you work at this intersection between climate change, environmental justice, and social equity. And let's try to keep those short introductions to about 2 minutes. So first we have Reverend Lennox Yearwood, who's the president and CEO of the Hip Hop Caucus. And then we have Dr. Adrienne Lynette Hollis, who is the Federal Policy Director at We Act for Environmental Justice. After that, we have Reverend Leo Woodbury, who is representing the community concerns about climate adaptation. Then we have Mustafa Santiago Ali, who is a senior advisor to EPA Administrator Gina McCarthy on environmental justice and a founding member of EPA's Office of Environmental Justice. And then finally, we have Damian Jones, who is the outreach specialist for the Climate and Energy Program at the Union of Concerned Scientists, and who is a huge trooper because he got in an accident coming here and is still here to join us. So thank you all, and can we get each of you to give us a little bit more background on your work on these issues and something we don't know from looking at your bio? Who wants to start?
Ladies first.
I knew you were going to say that. I guess I'll start. I am Adrienne Hollis. My office is down the street. I've been here 8 months. I'm the new director. Well, I'm not new anymore, I guess. Director of Federal Policy at We Act, which is a Manhattan-based community organization. So I have been working in environmental justice almost 20 years. I was a professor before I went to law school. I went to law school in 2007 in New Jersey. And then I went back to Tallahassee eventually, and now I'm back up here again. So what else do you want to know? That's enough?
Sure.
And my name is Reverend Leo Woodbury. I'm the pastor of Kingdom Living Temple Church and also executive director of New Alpha Community Development Corporation in Florence, South Carolina. We work on health issues, environmental justice and equity issues, as well as community economic development. We put all that together and shorten it by saying we work on environomics, where the environment and economics meet. And two things about me that even my good friends up here don't know after many years. I do spoken word. I just published a book of poetry called Wind Song, and I occasionally have art exhibits with the work that I do with acrylics.
Okay.
You want me to
go. Sure. Hey, everybody. I'm Mustafa Santiago Ali, the Senior Advisor to the Administrator for Environmental Justice and Community Revitalization, and also the Assistant Associate Administrator for Environmental Justice. Too many titles, too many letters, too long. Something that folks don't know. I ran track and played ball in college, which I guess is, not that big a deal, but okay. It's the first thing that popped in my mind. And that's it.
Good. I'll be brief as possible. Damian Jones, the outreach specialist for the Union of Concerned Scientists. Unlike many of my colleagues, I'm not a veteran to the EJ space, but a veteran of the social justice space and standing tall for underserved communities. I used to do stand-up comedy. That's one thing, but I wasn't funny, so they told me to sit down. So, and that's all. Good to be with you all.
Reverend Yearwood.
Yep, I'm Rev Yearwood, president of the Hip Hop Caucus. I'm the guy who brought you these great fans for this warm room. Isn't that awesome? Right on time. There it is. That's it. That's all you need to know, really. I'm the guy who brought you the fans. Also, we'll get more into this. Me and Mustafa went to the same college together. Probably didn't know that. We graduated from the amazing University of the District of Columbia, right here in D.C. So I actually played ball and didn't run track. I actually didn't run when I played ball. Actually, yes. Little small fact.
So first question, throughout the day, folks have been talking about environmental, economic, social disparities between groups, and how do you see climate change exacerbating those disparities, and what are examples from your work of where those challenges with climate change adaptation are going to arise? Who wants to start?
Well, I'll go ahead and start. I actually wanted to say this as we begin. I think that, clearly the ones who will be most impacted fast and furiously are those who are underserved communities, as well as communities of color and poor people. And I think that, the University of California did a great study on that, the climate impact in regards to 2009, looking at that, something that we already knew, those of us who survived originally from Louisiana, from Hurricane Katrina, and now those from Superstorm Sandy. This is the 4th year commemoration of that, and now even Hurricane Matthew. But I actually I don't want to say much because we have a great panel. I want them to kind of go into that. I'm going to actually talk more about some of the policies and what we do to mobilize against that. But I do want to state this, is that the Union of Concerned Scientists actually did something that I thought was very profound that we should discuss, which was they put out a statement, which was very important, on the climate on the ballot in Washington. And if many of you have been following that, there's an issue regarding how we can, in essence, cap and trade and tax carbon, and then the monies from that. And they actually took a position that I follow, which was kind of hard because you want that to happen. But then, on the other hand, because the monies from that weren't going back into the communities who are most impacted by climate change, and because the climate movement, in essence, moved this bill forward, the larger, and we'll probably get into what that means, the larger environmental movement moved that forward, it put us in a very unique position. But what it is, in essence, is that the impacts of climate change, which impacts communities of color, poor people, those who are underserved communities, that the monies from that would then go to literally into a fund, which we saw in California, which now actually has exceeded $1 billion, which can actually go into rebuilding schools, rebuilding infrastructure, and literally going into different resources in combating asthma, cancer, and emphysema. But what that did is that there is a missing component about how we actually deal with climate change, but also how we deal with legislation that impacts that. So I just definitely want to commend UCS on that, and want to stop there.
So I mentioned that I was, that WEACT is in Harlem, and so there they are in the midst of a very important study. The Northern Manhattan Climate Action Plan is part of the name of the project. And you can go to the website, WEAC's website, and see the information that they've gathered. And what they have done is under a project called the Urban Heat Island Project to determine what areas in Harlem are most at risk from the effects of climate change. And just to echo what Reverend Yearwood said, of course, we know that the most susceptible population will be those of low socioeconomic status and our EJ communities and the like. And what they found is in looking at things that protect you from the effects of extreme heat, land cover, canopies, trees, whatever, of course, are absent in the inner city, right? All you have is buildings, and then buildings absorb heat during the day and release it at night. So there's no protection. Most people don't have central air and those sorts of things, and there are very few cooling stations in the inner cities. And the Harlem study is just an example of what happens across the country. But it's interesting because they have developed these maps, and I think it's in cooperation with NRDC, National Resources Defense Council. So this is a great study, but I think it's going to be used to show this is going to be the first impacted community. So any resources that you're thinking about giving City of New York State of New York, you need to think about who's going to be first impacted. Because in these communities, most of them have roofs that are painted black. And what does black do? It absorbs, right? So now it won't serve any good purpose to put a solar panel on a black roof. So something as simple as painting the roof white would help a little bit, but that's too expensive. So I think I urge you to go to the website and, read about the study. And we've done some more things, but I'm sure my time is short. But I'll get it all in before we leave. I also want to say how excited I am to be among all of these very extremely handsome men. So thank you. I'm not crazy.
Well, thank you.
Especially you.
Thank you. I'm going to move from an urban setting to a rural setting because we're in Florence, South Carolina, though. I'm a native New Yorker, and yes, I do love New York, and if I could afford to live there now, I would probably move back. But moving to a rural setting, people, low-income people of color have always been impacted by the environment. I remember, we've had floods throughout South Carolina last year, and then a year and a day after the statewide flooding last year, we had Hurricane Matthew and the flooding that came after that. But one particular area called Britain's Neck, South Carolina, in Marion County and the city of Nichols were especially hard hit. They had to evacuate the entire population. My mother came from Britain's Neck, and I remember her saying that when she was a child back in the 30s and 40s, every spring that black community would get flooded until they built a dam in North Carolina to stop the flooding. So people of color, environmental justice communities have always been hit hard environmentally by impacts. But we're looking a lot at doing environmental justice analysis in terms of carbon and health impacts. But I think we also should look at it in terms of resilience. We have 27 dams in South Carolina that are currently in need of repair from the last round of flooding, where they never really were flooded before. And the county of Marion, where Britain's Neck and Nichols is 65% African American. The town of Nichols was virtually destroyed because it sits between two rivers, the Little PD River, the Big PD River. And so we need to look at in terms of resiliency, what can we do We need to be able to identify, not only identify, but come up with some forms of resiliency for those communities that are most vulnerable. And we have to be careful about that. I'll close by saying this. I was at a Ford Foundation breakfast meeting in New York earlier this month around the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, and they had a host of architects and engineers who were sitting in the room talking about what they should do in terms of habitat between now and 2036. And virtually they were actually sitting in the room saying, you know what? We can't save every place and everybody. So we need to look at where our efforts will do the greater good. And when the person said that, I thought about a book that's out, I can't remember the author right now, called Waterproofing New York. And that made me think, well, what are you guys talking about? You're talking about resiliency for gentrified communities? You're talking about letting the rest of us live in a place like Waterworld with Kevin Costner, or in the desert like Mad Max? And so that's one of the things that we need to look at. We need to look at not just the air emissions and health impacts that come from climate change, but also in terms of resilience and adaptation as well as mitigation.
Well, y'all don't really need me. You have the right folks who've been here speaking today. I came up as a student in the environmental justice movement, so over the past couple of decades, I've been able to work with over 500 communities across the country. And it always amazes me when we just now want to start talking about climate change and climate justice, because our communities have been talking about it since the beginning when I first got involved, and there were folks who've been in it much longer than myself. And sometimes, you know, when we come and I sit on these panels and we participate, it's difficult. And it's difficult because you remember all of the faces that you've seen over the years, and those who have dedicated their lives and who have crossed over, in many instances because of the impacts that were going on inside of their communities. Rev just talked about South Carolina. How many of y'all know where Princeville, North Carolina is? And what's going on there? And that it was a freedmen community. And now, when everybody else is being able to begin to move forward from the flooding, folks are still suffering in that space. And it's not the first time that it's happened. And unfortunately, equity is not always a part of the process when we start talking about redeveloping or revitalizing or talking about resiliency. I worry also when we talk about places like Manchester, Texas, that's in Houston, that is surrounded by petrochemical corporations, and the folks already have difficulty in breathing on a daily basis. I was just there a week ago. And when I took the first breath, it reminded me of why I've done this work for so long, because folks literally can't breathe. So then I always think about climate as an overlay on top of these challenges that are already happening in this space. So if you go to Port Arthur, Texas, where folks have been struggling also, and you overlay the additional impacts that are going to happen, it makes it real. It makes it really real for folks. And as I travel around the country, Native American brothers and sisters have been talking about climate change for a long time, especially those brothers and sisters who are in Alaska and other places where they've been seeing the changes that have happened, and we're speaking out and asking folks, what are we going to do about this? So one, I am happy, I guess you might say, that we are finally starting to pay attention to these impacts that are going to happen on a global level and also here domestically to all communities. But there's so much work that still needs to happen in the sense of those folks who have traditionally been disproportionately impacted and the changes that need to happen. So not only do we need to think about how do we help folks to become more resilient and adaptive in this space, but how are we going to help them to also revitalize their communities so that they are no longer attractive to those who would place things in their communities that are causing harm? So I think that's the best way for me to start. But I will also say, as we move forward on this panel, we'll also talk about some of the innovative things that are happening also to be able to benefit communities. I hope that we will also have a conversation about how young people are playing a role in that change, how academic institutions, at least those who are forward-thinking and progressive, are playing a role as well. And then also, Rev number 1 and Rev number 2 also talked about policy. But we should also talk about structures, and the structures that currently exist and the gaps that are there as well, if we're going to be serious about moving this agenda of helping vulnerable communities move from surviving to thriving. So I'll stop there.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mustafa. At UCS, we actually just published about a year ago a report around permanent inundation called Surviving and Thriving. So I appreciate that plug. Absolutely. The experts have kind of spoke on it a little bit, but Malcolm said it best. You know, when America has the flu, people of color have pneumonia. I mean, we always get it bad. We always get the brunt of it, right? But I think Mustafa said something just a moment ago that climate change, environmental justice has become sexy, if you will, popular, if you will. And there have been so many people on the forefront for so many years pushing this movement. And now it has become somewhat sexy, and you're seeing new faces in it. So I'm kind of glad, because you get more energy behind it, more resources, and so forth. So we want to get that work done. But one drawback of climate change that we don't think about oftentimes is preserving cultural heritage. You know, within all of this, a lot of the history in these Black and brown and red communities are lost. I was in South Carolina with the Gullah Geechee Nation in Quinquet, learning about that deep history. And if we lose history like that, we're going to be in trouble. But I'm going to tell you one thing, though, as I look around the room. I'm very encouraged to see young people in this room who are, I know many have had to leave, but who are pushing this movement. Every movement we see is led by young people. And so I'm glad it's going to be each one of you pushing this environmental justice movement, making change in the climate change movement. So I'm happy to be with you. And also, as a young person, I'm happy to be on this panel with such giants in the EJ movement as well.
So many of you raised recent extreme weather events from Sandy to Hurricane Matthew, but we also have extreme heat events and the disproportionate impacts that those events have on low-income and communities of color. What do you think we can do better? What are the policy responses? How is our response also disproportionately affecting communities of color and low-income communities, and how can we do disaster recovery and response better so that people are getting the services they need and our communities are building back in a way that's more resilient?
Maybe I'll start, and then I'll let folks build on it. So I like to use history as a teacher so that folks will have an understanding of how folks have been raising these issues, and in many times their voices weren't heard. So many of you in the room are old enough to remember Katrina, and you remember the impacts that happened there. But years before Katrina hit, there were folks who used to come and share at the National Environmental Justice Advisory Council meetings and the public comment periods, and many other opportunities where anyone would listen. And they talked about the area called Cancer Alley, from Baton Rouge to New Orleans. Many of you know that. And many of those communities who are there had been there since slavery was over, and they founded these communities, and then a number of corporations moved into the area and began to surround these communities. And folks used to come and share the impacts that were happening, and would also raise that if there was a release at one of these, these industries, then how would they escape? And folks used to tell them to do something called sort of like a shut-in type thing, where you pull down your windows and you wait it out. Now, folks used to share also that they had lack of access to transportation. Now fast forward to the storm. And if folks had actually paid attention and listened to these communities, then they would have understood that many of those residents didn't have access to automobiles. There were no bus systems put in place to help to move folks. So I share that so that you'll understand that, one, community folks have been thinking critically about these issues for decades. And that to the question that our moderator asked, when we start talking about equity, when we start talking about justice, the first place that we have to start in that process is actually listening to communities, one. Two, communities then have to actually have an active voice in that process that's going to influence that process, because that expertise that exists there, which is something that is a bit difficult for some folks to create that space to allow them to be able to help to influence that process. The other things that have to happen is that some of the decision makers need to have community-based experience or come from communities, and that does not happen very often. And some of you in the room know me, and I always talk about #real talk. So here's some real talk for you. If we want to make sure that there is equity in disaster planning, if we want to make sure that there is equity in the policies that we put forward, then that means that there needs to be the individuals who, one, have the experience, who come from these places, and who are connected so that there is authenticity that exists in that space. So until we have that, it's going to make it difficult for us to achieve some of the goals that we say that we want to do.
I was going to say that there's some really awesome work that's going on in the country in frontline communities, and we need to lift that work up. We need to replicate that work. I'm thinking about the work that SAGE is doing, the work that SAGE is doing in New York and LA, and the work that Uproads is doing in Brooklyn, working on microgrids, the work that State Representative Harold Mitchell has done in Spartanburg, South Carolina, where they've taken brownfields and sites that were polluting the community, textile mills and a landfill that's been closed, and gathered resources to build a solar farm to power 500 homes in the Arkwright community. There's a lot of good things going on, but in order to breathe more life into the work that we're doing, we talk about doing three things. We talk about CPR. We need greater coordination, we need proactive implementation, and we need regional replication. We need to move away from communities here, and here, struggling with very few resources, operating mostly off their passion and their love for the earth and people, and doing really great work, but not being able to replicate that work. And so I encourage folks to do that. And I, too, am just so excited to see so many young people in the room, young people who know me. I've been doing this for about 25 years. And the young people who know me know that I always say to them, please take my torch, it's burning my hand. So we just really need to lift up the things that work. I'll close by saying this, process is very important. I am so pleased that EPA, when they came out with the Clean Power Plan, and President Obama said that you had to have meaningful involvement from environmental justice communities. So when the stay is lifted, no state implementation plan will be accepted unless there's meaningful involvement. And we've used that process in South Carolina to make sure that we had some of our comments included in the comments made by the State Environmental Agency, even some of the utilities and co-ops, that we had a voice in organizing 8 public meetings and bringing in people in the community, that we sit on the stakeholder group that is tasked with writing the state implementation plan. We sit on the group that is tasked with writing the South Carolina State Energy Plan, and both of those groups have subcommittees for doing environmental justice analysis. And now the stage we're at now is implementation. So that just that meaningful involvement thing and our ability to define that as participation in the comment period, participation in public meetings, participation in planning, participation in implementation, and even more importantly, participation in evaluating what plans and activities go on in our community. So I see some really great things going on. I kind of wish I was you guys' age now, because we have so many tremendous opportunities, but we need to work together. We need to coordinate. We need to be proactive and save the ox before the ox goes into the ditch. And we need to replicate regionally the good work that's being done. I'll leave it there.
Can I follow up on that?
Yeah, of course.
So I want to follow up on that, and I think everything everybody said is correct. But let me take a step back. I think you in these conversations you can kind of miss the big picture of why government needs to be involved, why we're talking about communities that are impacted. You know, one of the things that recently happened. You know, first I'm glad to be here at this amazing institution at Georgetown University, in particular the Georgetown Law School. But on top of that, as we're dealing with climate change and we're dealing with the realities of climate change and what it will have not only on those who are impacted because of Hurricane Matthew, those who are right now who are dealing with it in South Carolina, North Carolina, how it's been impacted in Haiti and other parts of the world and other storms. Climate change is real, and the alarm is sounding. Every year is hotter than the last year and not getting cooler. We have folks who are in India because it's so hot. Farmers who are there are now beginning to commit suicide. You have children who are drowning themselves trying to avoid heat. There are wars that are rising up. Boko Haram in Nigeria and other things in farmlands and different are rising up against one another because of the drought and the farmers. What's happening in Syria is a direct reflection of climate change. So our world is literally falling apart. And so there are scientists in a couple weeks, the Paris Agreement will be ratified. And even though there isn't some legally aspects that are binding around that, it is clear that climate change is the issue of our day and what it will have an impact on not only now, but on the next generation. Why that's important is this reason, is that as human beings, there are times we have sounded the alarm before. During the time of slavery, the alarm was sounded because people said, listen, having people who are enslaved is wrong, particularly people, and having a commerce system based around slavery is wrong. We know that this institution had a Jesuit plantation project. They decided, even though there were those, and this is a Catholic Jesuit institution, so even if you Christian or of faith, you can get it wrong. And there were those who were the other groups who were saying that, listen, we should get away from slavery. Georgetown decided, well, no, we're going to figure this thing out. We're actually going to buy slaves. They actually bought some land on Eastern Shore, purchased slaves. They went, look at Georgetown's bylaws, said, listen, we have wealthy slave owners there. And ironically, the first president was actually mixed race, so then you had this whole dynamic going on here in Georgetown. But now when we look back, what was great last year or this year, Georgetown decided that, listen, we want to then look back upon that and recognize what we had and what we did with slavery, and we want to fix that. And there's some means being done. Now that's okay, right? That's fine. But the reality is this, though, is that that's dealing with equality. We're dealing with existence. And so you can't fix this 200 years from now. You can't come back and say, you know, we were relying with Exxon and BP and Chevron, and you know we should have known better, so we're going to fix it. We're going to create a fund, because there will be no people for a fund. And so what we're dealing with here at this moment is how we can use policy, litigation, how we can use legislation to stop the atrocity of climate change on our community. So with that, that's why this issue is so important and why it's not a game, because we won't be able to go back and fix what we didn't do 200 years ago. We now have to fix it now. For not only for the, and what's amazing is that not only fix it for those to come 200 years from now or 100 years from now, but as Leslie will tell you in her great work, we're fixing it right now for people right now who are in Flint, who are in South Carolina, who are around coal-fired power plants. I passed you out a fan. On that fan, it says that people of African-American voters are 30% in favor of the clean power plan. Is that right? 40%? 50%? 60%? What's on there? Numbers on there? 83%. For people of color, climate is not a partisan issue. And that's so important. I can tell if you're a person not of color, when you are either for or against climate, I can tell your political party. If you say, I am for the environment, more likely you are not Republican. If you are say, I'm for the climate, I can tell who you are. With people of color, you can't tell. Because you have black Republicans and black Democrats and blacks who are in the Green Party who are all for fixing the environment. That's powerful. But you don't have blacks and brown and red people leading the movement. That's a problem. And so we got to have that conversation. A conversation of urgency, because we can't come back and fix it like Georgetown did with a pen and be feel good and then, okay, we did this and that was wrong, and we do a little ceremony, we're going to invite folks to have some free scholarships. Yeah, okay. We can't do that with dead people. So we got to fix it now. And that's what this conversation must always be about. That type of urgency, when people are dying around you and when people will die in the future. That's the conversation that we must have today.
Okay, first of all, I can't follow the ministers. They're pulling my energy. We can't have this.
Damon, do you have anything?
Just going to put that ground rule out there. So I'm going to speak from two perspectives and give you two examples. What I didn't say is that the office, the DC office, also facilitates the Environmental Justice Leadership Council on Climate Change, which is about 40 different organizations who on their own are making heavy inroads in the climate battle. And together, we amplify our efforts. For example, today we worked on comments to the Clean Energy Incentive Program, which is part of the Clean Power Plan. So that is, something, and I guess we shared our, and Reverend, I'm looking at him because Reverend Woodbury and also Dr. Holloman are two of our forum members, as with Dr. McLean, who was here earlier, and a bunch of other people. And so that's a very important program that we're engaged in. Secondly, I am originally from Mobile, Alabama, and we grew up near, around, under the International Paper Mill. And if you have ever been around a paper mill, you know what it smells like. And we didn't know. So we used to always smell and make fun, kids, and we were told that was the way money smelled. And during the summer, my cousin used to drive a mosquito truck. I don't know if you guys know what that is. I'm really dating myself, but I forgot what it used to spray. It's illegal now. DDT.
Yeah.
And we used to run behind the truck, and to keep the mosquitoes off of you. So and what they would do is back the truck up in your backyard and the family members and let it run because you couldn't turn it off. It was the best summer job ever. And you just backed it up in your cousin's yard or your aunt or whatever and let it run all just for hours. And then we'd run behind the truck and play in the spray. We didn't know any better. So a lot of adverse health effects. Well, part of the issue is information and education. I don't know whether that's deliberate or to keep you quiet. I don't know. But one of the ways we're addressing issues around climate and resiliency and strengthening community engagement and building on community power is, in West Harlem at least, they're developing, I say they because they are in New York, a climate action kiosk where community members can go and actually get information on climate issues, get information on disaster preparedness. Because some of you may know about Bhopal, India, the big Union Carbide fire explosion, conspiracy, whatever you want to call it. But emergency preparedness was nowhere in that plan, and that still goes on today. Dr. McClain, if she were here, would tell you about how where one of her communities that I've worked with her in, they live around 17 different facilities, some of which don't have an emergency preparedness plan, which I thought was mandatory, but under law, but maybe not. So one way is education is the key. I do believe that. And we learn from people and from different people because everybody has different experiences. And I want to, I guess, recognize my intern, Morgan Pennington over there, who's here from Alabama, but from Northern Alabama, who taught me about an EJ community organization in my city a couple of weeks ago. The MEJAC, and I actually met one of the co-founders. I didn't know him, and I was like, "Oh, do you know about the MEJAC?" And he was like, "Yes, I founded it," which was very interesting. But the point is that, they were just the information that's available that people don't have access to is very important, and I think it goes a long way to enhance the progress we're making in our battle against climate change and other environmental assaults and insults.
If I could add, because I just want to build on what Dr. Hollis is just talking about. So in an effort to help to increase the education and some of the planning that's happening, I want to share a few things with you all, and you can take a peek at them, and maybe you'll also be able to help them to be shared in the places that they should. So at the Environmental Protection Agency, there's the Environmental Finance Centers. And that's important because when folks are thinking about the planning process and infrastructure and the various things that are going to be necessary to be able to address these impacts from climate change, that resource can help folks to begin to navigate that process. The other thing that I'll raise for you guys is the Water Finance Center. And as we begin to talk about water infrastructure and the needs that exist in that space, that is another resource that can help folks. A couple of the others that I'll raise is the collaborative problem solving cooperative agreements. That came out of the Office of Environmental Justice, and it actually came out of a set of conversations with stakeholders who were sort of helping folks to understand where some of the gaps still are. And that particular program, some folks have used it in relationship to climate, especially in relationship. One of the projects was up in Massachusetts, helping communities have a better understanding of some of the impacts from stormwater and how they could play a role in helping to address that with their local municipality. And then most folks know about the Environmental Justice Small Grants Program, which again came out of a set of recommendations from stakeholders a number of years ago, and has provided about $25 million in resources to communities. And in some instances is a first step for some communities. And, there are a number of other types of programs that are out there. The last two that I mentioned, have specifically been focused on our most vulnerable communities. The others, the centers that I talked about, we still, as they are evolving and growing, need to, one, ensure that equity is a focus in that process, and also that institutions who serve some of the communities that we've been talking about are also in the mix in that sense. There are a couple of other things that are out there that you guys also want to pay attention to in relationship to climate. One of them is the State Revolving Fund. Most people know the SRF, and they have a component that focuses on climate, and they have checklists and those different types of things. And then I'll mention one of the other big programs that most folks know, and of course that's the Brownfields program. And they also have a climate component that's a part of that as well. So there are some resources. But with that being said, that's just talking about the Environmental Protection Agency. The questions also have to be, about the other federal agencies and the role that they play. Now, the White House has been doing some great work in that space and getting some of them, engaged in overall planning. But I'll also go back and raise again the equity conversation, and that is an ongoing one that needs to be expanded, and I'm glad that it's happening and that folks are now beginning to incorporate that into the overall process. But that conversation, again, not only with the communities who sometimes can't find traction and who haven't gotten or been recipients of some of the funding that's out there. So having this focus now will help in that space, but also in the individuals who are sitting on these respective bodies and who are making choices is something also that we must be focused on, making sure that there's equity and diversity that's happening in that space as well. So I'll stop right there.
No, that's a good pivot, because I was hoping to close on a hopeful note, and that is a good pivot to policy. And I wanted to get all of your perspectives about, what gives you hope? What are those bright spots that you're seeing in the communities where you live, in the communities that you work in, where they're implementing good, sound processes or good, sound policies, and what are those examples that we can hold up to others to replicate? And Adrian and Mustafa, I was hoping that you could talk a little bit about federal policy and what should be the priorities in the next administration
Y'all trying to get
on
me
these
fired.
issues.
Well, let me just say a couple of places that I think folks have made some progress over the last couple of years. And one, Reverend Woodbury talked about, which is the Clean Power Plan. For those of us who've been working on environmental justice issues for years, there was always a struggle to get our voices included in that process in a substantive way. And as I said, I believe in real talk. And that happened because there were stakeholders, one, who knew their stuff, and two, continued to push on that process to make sure that what was being developed had some reflection from the communities who need that help the most. Another area that I find positive is in the refinery rule, because again, as I had mentioned earlier, a number of our communities are next to the fence lines, and because of the voices and experiences of stakeholders who come from communities with environmental justice concerns, they help to make that process better. Now, let me say that there are all kinds of other stakeholders who are also a part of that, but, and it's better for some of the folks who are coming from the grassroots to probably respond to that. In the 20-plus years that I've been doing this work, this is one of the first times that I've seen the voices of communities reflected in a substantive way. Now, the people have participated in some of the other, rules that have been over the years, but this is one of the times that I've seen that. But I'll also be clear in saying that there's so much more that can happen in that space, and I'll leave it there.
I've got to offer my support for what you just said, because when I years ago, communities would come to meetings, and people would be very passionate and very upset, angry, or and they'd have a right to be. And I think but they'd express themselves. I felt like it was different. I went to a meeting in EPA Region 5 recently on the clean energy incentive program, and people were calmly and clearly expressing themselves, and I was pleasantly surprised, because the number of people who participated meaningfully in that conversation and who have been talking about they're submitting comments, on this document, and they submitted comments on the last iteration, and the Clean Power Plan comments were, I guess, submitted before I was at WEACT. So I know there was a huge group of people who got together because EJ wasn't part of that initial conversation, and now it looks a heck of a lot better. I don't want to say the wrong word. So, but, and I have to lift up our other people. We have within our forum a group of people we call SEJAs, State Environmental Justice Advocates. And that group is specifically tasked, well, everybody is, but we're following them as they become integrated in their states' activities to develop how they're going to implement the Clean Power Plan. And of course, with the states, some states are not, don't want to do anything, and I'll let you talk about that. And some states are doing a little bit, and some states have already done things. But the role that communities are, in some instances, insisting that they play in development and policy initiatives around, in this instance, the Clean Power Plan, is important and heartening, and frustrating. I'm on my way to Mississippi in a couple of hours to meet with the community there who's having a problem because there may be some people in the state who have decided that they don't know what the Clean Power Plan is, never heard of it. And they happen to be officials. So that's not necessarily the truth, but they aren't willing to include community in their discussion. So we're going down there to see what we can do and how we can get the media involved and things of that nature. So I am heartened to see the level at which communities and others have just approached things in a way that they think other people will understand because they're not listening. So if you can't listen to what we're saying this way, we'll talk to you. Those might be able to understand. You guys might not know, but when your mom used to punish you, I'd say whip you. I'm from the South. She would say, "I'm gonna talk to you like you understand," and then you'd get a spanking. Not me though, but I heard about it. But but seriously, so and that and the involvement that I've seen with the young people today is very exciting. We have to constantly keep all of our interns we've ever had like, calm down. You're not Erin Brockovich, including that one over there. So, but the passion, you don't want them to lose that, And so that to me says that there's a lot of hope for the future, the near future.
I guess I'll just pick up from the young folk. That's my key. That's the key. That was the key. I'm president of the Hip Hop Caucus, which is an organization that uses one's cultural expression to shape one's political experience. And so very proud of that. We've grown to be in 25 cities across the country. And working with celebrities. And what I'm hopeful for me is when I look back about I guess now, that was to be about almost 3.5 years ago. One of the things is that we were here gathered for the Ford on Climate rally, working with groups like Sierra Club and 350, and many of the indigenous communities who were there fighting against the Keystone XL pipeline, which was considered a done deal. And many of the young people and folks on the front line, indigenous community, and mainline environmental groups said no. And because they came together, we stopped that pipeline. And I just came from Standing Rock the other day, and where there are folks who are fighting against the Dakota Access Pipeline. And they are, again, rising up, and this time stating that water is life. And I can't tell you, if you have not been to Standing Rock, you should go. If you're in the movement, it is amazing. It was growing while I was there. When I was there, there was 8,000 people, and it's not just about community, but about that the nations coming together. And you should understand, like any other nation, they had problems themselves, and they are putting all of that aside and coming together to stand up in North Dakota. And I'm so hopeful to see the thousands who are gathering in Standing Rock with the Sioux Nation and other nations, Lakota Nation and other nations rising up. I'm also thinking to see them leading. It's very powerful. I'm also hopeful to see my friends who are in the industry, like Willow and Jaden Smith, who are part of that movement, along with Shailene Woodley and Josh Fox and others. So Mark Ruffalo there. But I'm also excited about young folks on campuses like here at Georgetown and at Harvard and in HBCUs who are pushing for a divestment movement, pushing their boards to divest from fossil fuels. And that's very important that you can do that literally here on campus and push to say, listen, we must transition from fossil fuels, and see Georgetown divest and Maryland divest, and seeing that happen, and now seeing trillions of dollars being divested from fossil fuels, seeing the Rockefellers who made their money from fossil fuels divest from fossil fuels and saying transition. And I think the one thing that makes me the most hopeful in all of this is the folks on the stage and also you, but my friends who are from over there, from Hampton and over and from that part of the world, who have the Mott House and have other places, who don't forget that we are a proud and mighty people.
Yeah.
And they remind us of that. And so sometimes the language in these conversations could be very demeaning. You're at risk. You're underserved. We're here to help you. You know, and it becomes very, very much a usatory. And there are folks who are rising up, black people and brown people and red people, who throw off because they say we have nothing to lose but our chains. And so they're rising up, stating that we can speak to the young folks in Chicago, we can speak to these coal-fired power plants in our community, and the young folks in Oregon and Washington and Massachusetts who are suing, using litigation to sue for their future. That is so hopeful to me, because this is a battle that none of us probably will see if we win. Unlike those who are civil rights movement who can see President Obama and can see a MLK memorial, they can see the fruits of what they did in SNCC. We may not see that. Most of us will be dead and won't see if we win. But the powerful thing is that if we keep on this pattern of humans rising up, black, white, brown, yellow, male, female, straight, gay, theist, atheist, humans, rising up for this planet, then that makes me hopeful, because in the next generation, who I will never see, will have simply clean air and clean water. And that makes me hopeful.
Damien, you wanted to jump in?
Yeah, really quickly. When I visited Bridgeport, Connecticut. I don't know if any of you have ever been there. Beautiful city, but when I walked through the neighborhood of color, if you will, I wasn't particularly hopeful, to be honest with you, because you could see the effects that the coal plant that's very near, pretty much smack dab in the community, is having on the community. Young people dying at a high rate because of asthma. The elderly who just want to sit on their porch and just enjoy a nice day, but they look to their right and they see a heap of coal. I mean, it's almost touching the sky, and those are the types of things they have to deal with. So I'm not hopeful when I see things of that nature. But from a UCS standpoint, when we align with this coalition that's been formed, Building Equity and Alliance group, which is a group of about 100, a good number of groups that want to focus on equity. I think Mustafa talked about it earlier, having equity at the center, not as a add-on to our work, but at the center, at the beginning of our work. I'm hopeful when you see groups like that who just had a forum in Houston with about 150 groups talking about the Clean Power Plan and the CEIP and the ways in which that we can make it better and we can force those comments and make it better for people of color. I'm very hopeful about that. And so when you have those types of conversations, it also forces big green groups, of which I'm a part of, to connect with the community groups, which often their comments, their perspectives are left out. You helicopter in, take their information and fly out and take all the credit for it. So I mean, it happens all the time. And so I'm hopeful when those types of conversations are happening. As a byproduct of that, you will begin to see more faces of color inside the big green organizations as we bring in those perspectives to make the work more wholesome. But as the Reverend said, I'm just so hopeful when I look around this room and see many of you. Leslie was saying that she's an alum here. When did you graduate, Leslie? 2001, 2002? Was it? So very hopeful because all of you will be pushing this movement and leading into the next century, and you'll tell your children about it and so forth. And so we need your energy, we need your fervor, we need your knowledge, we need your intellect to continue to help the people here and also push and help those around you, those who don't have the resources you have, those who didn't grow up like you, those who are at risk. We need you. So I'm hopeful when I look into your eyes and I see the passion that you have and that you're spending your late Thursday, you could be going like many others, you're still here learning and listening and invested in how to make America better. One more thing I forgot to say that I'm not hopeful about is when we look at these presidential debates, the lack of question, the lack of conversation around climate change and equity around those types of things. Not hopeful about that, but I'm hopeful when I look around this room.
Reverend Woodbury, do you want to have the last word before we get you to the airport?
Yeah, that's a good idea. Else I'm sleeping on somebody's couch tonight. Okay. I'm hopeful because I remember the day and the time like Vernice and Leslie Fields and several of us here when the words environmental justice wouldn't even allow you into the room. When those two words were considered too militant, and we were considered disruptive, and they were rejected. And the needle got moved because a whole lot of people came together and worked together. And we can talk about policy, legislation. I'm going to talk about some policy that makes me hopeful. We can talk about all of those things, but to quote G Money from New Jack City, we got. All we have for real is each other. And so I'm hopeful when, I look at Act 236 in South Carolina that opened the state up to solar, and it called for a coalition of folks who generally don't work together, conservation groups and preservation groups and academic institutions and young people and environmental justice groups and faith groups, and we were able to get that bill passed. I'm hopeful when I look at the piece of legislation that Representative Harold Mitchell got passed that identified 29 landfills in South Carolina that are closed that can be turned into solar farms or engines of economic development, and the state has put aside not a lot of money, but a start, $25 million for that. So I'm hopeful when I see policy changes and people replicating work, so like the folks with the Mississippi clean energy team that you're referring to, that we came together and Dr. Keys and Yassine Shabazz, and we talked about what was going on in Mississippi and what was going on in South Carolina, and we created 4 regional hubs in South Carolina, and they created 5 regional hubs in Mississippi so that we could bring people together and speak with one voice and speak truth to power and tell people that it's time for us to speak life and not death. It's time for us to stop powering our country and our world with dead things. We don't need energy to come from the remains of dinosaurs that's been buried in the ground for millions of years. We don't need energy from coal that is buried in the ground as if it's interned in a grave. We need life-giving energy that comes from the wind and comes from the sun. And so we have to develop that, but we can't do it alone. We can't move the needle siloed and isolated. It takes all of us voting together. It takes all of us working on policy, and I believe it's going to take all of us doing some direct action. Just like in 2014 with the climate march that turned out 400,000 people, we're going to have to go in the streets. We're going to have to speak out. We're going to have to let our voices be heard, because sometimes that's the only way, as with Standing Rock, that you can get the attention of the media. Sometimes that's the only way that you can have your voice heard over the nonsense of reality TV and celebrity charades. So I'm very hopeful. And as I said, you can have my torch that is burning my hand and move us forward to a better world. It's going to be a long struggle. It's going to be a hard struggle. But the great thing about America in this world is that come what may and come what might, we always seem to be able to make progress. And I'll say one last thing, and I say this often, especially in the South. Not too long ago, we people of different colors, different ethnic groups, could not even sit in a room like this in parts of this country. We couldn't be black and brown and white and talking about challenging the system and changing policy, because we've been dragged out of buildings across America.
Still being dragged out.
Yeah, we do. Not as much, but you know. So we do make progress, and we're not perfect, and our world will never be perfect. But it's our calling, and the clarion call that we have to share with the rest of the world is that things will get better, that they do get better, that we believe in humanity, we believe in the power of caring and the power of love. And so I'll just close with that.
So before, so before we lose Dr. Hollis and Reverend Woodbury, I wanted to thank you all for some very stimulating real talk. Thanks so much for being part of our panel and joining us here at Georgetown. And I was hoping that the audience could to join me in a round of applause for the panel and for the great student groups that made this exciting and wonderful event happen. And so I think we have to lose 2 of our panelists, unfortunately, to get them to the airport, but I hope everyone else can stick around and take some questions from the audience.
You too.
Thank you so much. Yeah, nice to meet you too, and hopefully we'll run into you again. Neighbors. Thank you so much for coming up.
Yeah, road is rough. No. Oh.
You guys can spread out a little bit. You got a question?
Rev got the seat hot.
Hello. I think it's on.
Hi, I had a question that I'm sure many of the students in the room were wondering. You all mentioned seeing hope in young people, and many of us are young law students here at Georgetown. I was wondering if you have any specific advice as to how we can get involved in environmental justice while we're still students at Georgetown.
You want me to answer? It's real simple. So there are environmental justice networks and organizations all across the country who could use your assistance. But I always remind folks, for those who have come out of the environmental justice movement, there is a phrase that says communities speak for themselves. So you want to come to that space and honor that, and bring your expertise in learning. But also, one of the things I did for a long time was to listen, so that I would have a very good understanding of some of the things that were going on and the ways that folks have approached them. So I would say that your help and many other students in a number of different disciplines are very much welcomed and needed. And I look forward to seeing all of you out there helping to make change.
Does anyone else have questions, or does anyone else want to speak to that?
Yeah, this will definitely here at Georgetown or any law school. Clearly, around the country, as I mentioned before, there is a robust divestment movement going on, and so and most law students sometimes come from other schools. So I think that's a key thing to be involved. What's happening on campus to really continue to push that. 'Cause I think that will have a huge impact if more of our institutions divest locally in DC. We've had some great wins in that area, which I think that many people can get involved with. Clearly, as I say in real estate, location, location, location. So clearly, Georgetown Law School, being where it is, being literally feet almost from the Congress and in essence from the White House as well, can have a huge impact. It would be very important, I think, for law students to be in a position to begin to discuss and to teach the aspects of litigation. Litigation is a very drawn-out process, as you know, and so people don't see the victories right away. And so there is a concern sometimes that people who are on the front lines get discouraged quickly because they're not seeing, because once it goes into the courts, they think, okay, well, we won. And as you know, for most of you who are now either first year, second year, third year, or who are lawyers, no, that's not how this works. It doesn't work that way. And there's a constant process. Even in Standing Rock in North Dakota, they would have a win one week and have a loss the very next week. There is a need for particularly young lawyers to explain that. One of the things that we say in Hip Hop Caucus is that demonstration without legislation or litigation leads to frustration. And so that's key because we can have demonstration, but if we don't have legislation or litigation, there will surely be frustration. So I think that it's important for a lot of, as Mustafa said quite well, there's a lot of organizations who need young lawyers or lawyers to be or folks in that process. I think also from a clinical standpoint, there's a lot of direct action taking place. And so there is a need for legal observers. It is getting very tense in the streets. Right around the corner at the at FERC, the Federal Energy Reserve Commission, which actually gives which actually grants the pipelines. There's been demonstrations there. Folks, EPA sometimes usually has been good, but sometimes we actually take it to EPA as well. And other agencies, you know, I've been honored inside the White House. I've been arrested outside the White House. So it all depends on how it goes down. But you need young lawyers to be there as observers, to be there to really teach people, and this is important. There's also progressive communities sometimes, or communities who understand, they think getting arrested is a badge of honor. And so they get excited. They say, man, we're going to get arrested, and it's great. Yeah. For communities of color, a lot of times, that ain't so the case.
Right. We already got some things. On
We're not looking to get arrested. So when they're getting arrested, it's important for them to really understand sometimes the things that go on if you have things on your arrest record, if you already have certain aspects. Being in the system, it's not, you know, so that's very important, particularly as we are, a lot of times with climate justice and also with things around Black Lives Matter are beginning to meld more closely together in these movements. It's really important for a lot of young lawyers. And then finally, there's a lot of groups like Earth Justice. The planet needs a good attorney. I think is that the slogan, Leslie? Is it the planet need? Not know yourself, but I know Earth Justice slogan is the planet needs a good. The planet is a good lawyer. There it is. So. The Earth is a good lawyer. That's the slogan. I'm just giving it up to Earth Justice. But there are a lot of groups, even within the larger big enviros, who do have legal departments within them, from Sierra Club, NRDC, Earth Justice. And I do think that getting the training in those, and then taking that training and then coming to smaller groups like We Act and Hip Hop Caucus is important. That would be great, very helpful. Groups who really can't afford a lot of times to have on-staff research and legal, you can help groups like Hip Hop Caucus and We Act and smaller groups in those aspects.
Yeah.
Something came to mind. I'm sorry, Reverend, but I think one of the first things you could do, you're lawyers, so I'm sure you know how to write very well. Writing letters to your Congress people, just in your own personal time. You don't need a group to do that. Just as a American citizen, write a letter to urge them to think, to push, to advocate a certain way. That's your American right and your moral obligation. I think you should do that. Another thing is the People's Climate March. And Reverend Woodbury mentioned it earlier, but I think it's in April of next year. You guys should look into being a part of that. As he said, getting in the streets, getting out in the streets. And the last thing, I'm a big proponent of it. Sometimes I get in trouble for saying it. You'll see on my bio that I've done it as well. Be prepared to raise holy hell for these issues. Raise hell. That's how we get things done. I think the Reverend talked about SNCC and SCLC and those other groups back in the day, and they had very innovative ideas and tactics how to get awareness to their issues. So you raise hell, you demonstrate, but we also need litigation, and that's where your expertise comes in as well. But you need litigation, but you need some people who are willing to raise hell and go to jail for these particular issues, right? And when we do that, then we can begin to see more and more movement and so forth. So, hey, raise hell, write those letters, and look into the People's Climate March.
Haley, do you want the last word? You're holding the microphone. One last question, quick? Sure. We have 5 minutes. Is that okay?
Does anyone else have a question?
Okay.
Thank you so much for being here. This is a similar question, but slightly different. And I'm honored to be able to ask the three of you this. So similarly, how do we talk to people who aren't in the environmental community or the EJ community, or who aren't policymakers, who are apathetic and watching the debates and not hearing anything about this, and they're not in these communities that are hearing about it maybe in their communities of faith or whatever? How do we talk to people around the Thanksgiving dinner table about this issue that we care about so much when they maybe haven't even heard of it before and it's coming from a very different place? Thank you.
Well, I use it for a shameless plug. Thank you. I use this. If you're on the flip side of your fan, you have People's Climate Music, and that's something that was created to actually recreate music and that kind of stuff. And so we actually have a few albums that was created. We actually have the Home album, which was done with Neo and Common and a bunch of other artists. If you want to pick that up, and you can play it during Thanksgiving or during Indigenous time, whatever that time is. I don't, that season. But I'll say this in closing, and I'll borrow what Reverend Woodbridge said earlier, which was around the word of love. Our goal is not to be right. Our goal is to create change. Too many times in our movement, people want to be right and assume because they're right, that's good enough. And they don't come with love. And our ultimate goal for this movement is about how do we get folks to know what's happening and to create ways that they can hear us. Know that this is a very political issue now for many, and I'm assuming for many families. My family is not that political, actually, but for those of your families who are, it is political, who just think you are a tree hugger or whatever else they may want to call you around Thanksgiving. Know that if you come with love and know that to give folks that space and to come and really state your issue, you can create change. And I say that really in sincere, because I know a lot of families, people who actually miss opportunities to talk about this at Thanksgiving or around, Hanukkah or Ramadan or whatever holiday, or no holiday. But I think it's opportunity. I just want to add one thing too. As with language is important, and so as we're talking about Thanksgiving, please will be a great time to bring up Standing Rock and the indigenous communities and the native nations in this So even to have that conversation first about what we did to Native communities and then go from there into what they're fighting for might be a great segue around that, whatever it is you're celebrating.
Yeah. So one of the things Rev said was really important. He said language. And I think that, you know, I've worked with everyone from NASA scientists to engineers to attorneys, grassroots folks. And I've found that there are a couple of different ways of approaching these issues to help define traction. One is you have to become knowledgeable about the successes that have happened in this space. Lots of times I will share with folks the examples of how communities have been able to make change. So where they came from, the impacts that were happening, but how through collaborative processes, they've actually been able to move forward. So in many instances, folks want to have an idea of, so how can we see the goal line, if you will, or how can we see progress in this space? So that's one set of folks. That's usually for folks who are a bit more analytical. I was at Georgia Tech not long ago. An engineer came up afterwards. He had been an engineer for about 40 years. And he said, you know what, I never got this environmental justice thing or climate justice thing until you began to break it down in the segments for me that I could actually, as an engineer, think about step one, step two, step three type thing. That's one set of folks. And for those of you who know me in the room, you know there's another sort of paradigm that I work from, which is just keeping it simple, if you will. And so sometimes we complicate these issues, and they are complicated issues, but I think that sometimes we sort of frame it in a way that most folks can't get. So I do this. I ask everyone to take a deep breath. Everybody just take a deep breath. And then let it out. And then for far too many communities, that's not a reality. That's something that they don't have the ability to do. And if we don't address the issues that we've been talking about here today, there will be more and more folks who will have that difficulty in being able to do that. Sometimes people say, well, you know, is clean air a human right? I keep it real simple. If you don't have it, what happens? So again, it's important to be able to talk about parts per trillion and parts per billion and parts per million. But if I'm Mrs. Ramirez, I want to know, is my baby going to be able to breathe? Is my baby going to have problems with asthma? You know, those types of things. So keep it simple. The other thing I do, and people, the stuff I do is not rocket science. People ask me to come speak all over the country. And it's real simple stuff. The other question I ask folks is, have you taken a drink of water in the last 24 hours? It's hard to find somebody who hasn't. And we all know what happens if you don't have that ability. So the issues that we are talking about are that simple. We're talking about clean, breathable air. We're talking about fresh, drinkable water. And we've been, unfortunately, in many instances, not doing the job that we should be doing in that space. And for me, it's that simple. When we can get those basic things right, then we can start to ensure that life is actually happening. You know, Dr. King said, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. The change is that now folks are focusing on justice. And that I see as an optimistic moment. For me, it's transformational. And I believe, and I'm an optimist, I believe that we are going to be able to solve these real challenges that we have. And we're going to be able to help the communities who have traditionally been left behind to be able to move forward. But we have to do it together, but we have to make sure that those voices from those communities is a leader in that process.
And I played basketball with him. He's an optimist.
Are these closing words?
Closing
if you
words.
will? Well, I'll say quickly, and Mustafa said it, keep it simple. So what made me kind of understand this, and Amber and I talked about this kind of the first time when she found me on another panel. My supervisor, Kate Sale, kind of sat me down and she gave me this picture about the impact of environmental justice, climate change, and so forth. Just imagine, you have a black and brown or brown kid growing up because of normal circumstances. He's probably growing up in dilapidated housing, if you will. Let's just say there's some mold, asbestos exposure in that particular home. Let's just say the pipes aren't up to date and that young person drinks that water, breathes that dirty air, as we talked about. And then that person, it affects their brain. It affects their brain and their functions. And they go to school and they begin to maybe act out a little bit. And they're diagnosed with maybe ADHD. Maybe they have a learning disability or something like that, right? And then that person maybe would have problems with authority and so forth. And what happens to black and brown kids in schools? They throw them in detention, they expel them, they kick them out of school and so forth like that. And so when the young people aren't in school, the numbers show that they probably are going to get in jail sometime soon, and then they're going to get right into that prison pipeline system. And so I think you kind of see there, I hope I painted the picture, how climate change, climate justice, environmental racism, environmental justice all intertwines in our lives. It's not just in one silo. I mean, it affects everything, right? If poor people don't have adequate resources, they don't have clean water, it's going to affect them. It's going to affect their brains. It's going to affect how they socialize in society. It's going to affect how people look at them. And again, as you see, when you talk about that prison, the pipeline system, you can find a connection right back to environmental justice, environmental racism. So it's all interconnected. And so for me, that made it really simple for me, because we can talk about criminal justice, we can talk about education, we can talk about economics in this country when it comes to poor people. But right there, that should be on the forefront with those particular issues, is environmental justice and racism. Is very, very, very important. So I'm glad that it's become sexy now, right? I'm glad because you see more resources, more attention gained to it, but we have so much work to do. And again, as the experts have said, that we're so hopeful. But when you have those conversations around that delicious turkey and stuffing and so forth, as Mustafa said, try to keep it as simple as possible and just kind of, ask those, put yourselves in these folks' shoes. If it were your brother, sister, cousin, or what have you, we kind of look over things oftentimes because it doesn't affect us. It's not at our doorstep. But I can tell you, the three of us, at least, it's at our doorstep each and every day. We know people directly affected by these things, and it hurts. It really hurts, and we want to try to do something. So just ask those folks to kind of wear the shoes the best they can of those people affected and those people, those communities being ravaged by these particular things, by environmental racism, on top of racism, on top of economic injustice, on top of housing discrimination and so forth. And so, I mean, it's crazy, but yeah, try to have those conversations as simple as possible.
Thank you, everybody, so much for your questions. And can we give one more round of applause for Jessica and our panelists for taking their time? I know I'm not the only one who was very moved.